Some people survived the Middle Ages not by living well, but by eating whatever kept them from dying. Their meals hid desperation beneath ordinary habits, turning bark, insects, and spoiled food into daily reality. Storage pits, smoked rafters, salted barrels, and quiet fear shaped every bite. What kept families alive was never abundance, only strategy and endurance. Tonight, don't we walk through that world and see what survival truly tasted like? So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, to leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of a medieval village and watch how people handled their food from one season to another, it would become clear that survival depended less on choice and more on timing. The landscape dictated every meal. Fields, orchards, and livestock offered what they could, but only when the year allowed it. No household expected abundance to last. Food appeared, vanished, and returned according to cycles that no one could change. Life was shaped by the certainty that nothing was available for long. The villagers understood this without needing to speak of it. Their routines, their habits, and even their expectations were carved entirely by the temper of the seasons. During the warmer months, small bursts of variety appeared. Fresh herbs grew along the edges of paths, their leaves clipped before the sun dried them. Vegetables rose slowly from the soil, offering modest colours to meals that were otherwise pale. Milk flowed more regularly, though never in great amounts. Eggs were gathered early each morning when the hens were willing. Everything felt temporary, like moments borrowed from time rather than granted by it. People gathered what they could, storing small pieces away with quiet care, knowing they would miss the taste of freshness once the air turned cold. Summer did not bring abundance, it only brought relief. Even in the most generous fields, harvests were measured by need rather than pleasure. Families counted their stores as carefully as merchants counted coins. Any error, an unexpected storm, livestock illness, or a failed crop could change the entire year's security. For many, the warm season was not a period of comfort, but a reminder of how fragile their food supply truly was. While travellers might imagine that green fields meant full tables, villagers knew better. What they saw was the narrow window in which they had to prepare for the long months ahead. When autumn arrived, its beauty meant nothing. It was a signal to hurry. People gathered root vegetables, hung herbs from rafters, and salted what little meat they had. They filled jars, pots, sacks, and baskets. They dried, smoked, and buried food wherever the earth stayed cool enough to hold it. Every household felt the same pressure. Storage was survival. The quantities rarely felt sufficient, even if the shelves looked heavy at the start. A quiet fear crept in the moment the first frost appeared. Everyone had seen families run out too early. Everyone understood that a well-prepared home in autumn could become an empty one by February. Winter revealed the truth about medieval life more clearly than any chronicle. When the days shortened and the ground hardened, almost nothing fresh remained. People turned instinctively toward what they had preserved months before. Salted meat, dense loaves, dried peas, hard cheese, and old grains filled their bowls. Meals grew repetitive, heavy, and silent. The cold made hunger sharper, yet there was never more to give. Milk became scarce as animals stopped producing. Fresh vegetables vanished entirely. Fruit existed only as memory. Even the wealthier households relied heavily on foods that had been changed, dried, salted, or smoked into something that no longer resembled their original form. There were winters when sickness arrived early and left slowly. Those with weak stomachs struggled with preserved food. But there was nothing else to offer. Meat salted too harshly became nearly impossible to chew. Grains developed a dull, bitter smell when stored too close to moisture. Dried vegetables softened unevenly in water, leaving fibers that refused to break down. People forced these meals down because hunger left them no other choice. Eating was rarely pleasant. It was simply necessary. The seasons stripped away any illusion about the nature of food in this world. What survived the storage was all they had. Children learned the rhythms early. They knew not to ask for milk in winter or for berries in spring. They learned the quiet discipline of waiting for seasons to return. Their parents had lived the same way, and their grandparents before them. The limits were inherited, not questioned. The idea of having the same food available every month of the year was unimaginable. Even a small luxury, like a pot of honey, was stored so carefully that it might last for years, touched only when someone fell sick or a rare celebration demanded it. The threat beneath all of this was unpredictability. A late frost could ruin blossoms. Too much rain could flatten fields. Too little rain could starve them. A disease among livestock could leave entire villages without dairy for months. When something went wrong, there was no system to support them. No hidden warehouse. No trade network ready to fill the gap. Scarcity was not an exception. It was the constant companion of every household. People adapted not because they wanted to, but because nature gave them no alternative. The seasons dictated the pace of work as much as the availability of food. In spring, the soil had to be prepared quickly, or nothing would grow. In summer, fields demanded endless attention. In autumn, every hand was needed for storing. By winter, exhaustion settled in, yet worry prevented anyone from resting fully. As supplies grew smaller, meals grew thinner. Sometimes, entire families survived on nothing more than broth made from old bones and bread. So dense, it needed warm liquid to soften. Every household, regardless of status, felt the same tightening grip as winter deepened. Even within communities where people shared what little they had, the seasons divided them. Those with slightly better harvests or more animals had a small advantage, but not enough to ease anxiety. The difference between comfort and struggle was measured in handfuls, not barns, and even the wealthiest were only a few failed harvests away from scarcity. The cycles of hunger were woven into the fabric of life. No feast, no celebration, no temporary abundance could erase the weight of the months when food was little more than a hope. Travelers often misinterpret the quiet expressions of villagers eating their simple meals. What looked like resignation was actually understanding. These people had grown up seeing how easily hunger could return. Their relationship with food was built on caution, not enjoyment. Every bite taken in winter carried a calculation: how much remained, and how long would it last? The harshness of the season was not a catastrophe. It was expected. It would leave, and it would return, just as it always had. Villagers did not need to speak of scarcity. They felt it in their bones. It shaped their behavior, their expectations, and their fears. The rhythm of the year was not a story of abundance, but a cycle of brief opportunity, followed by long endurance. Freshness was a fleeting visitor. Preservation was a constant labor. And survival depended entirely on how well they balanced those two realities. Everything described here reflects only the first layer of how people endured the limits of nature. Another realm of survival rested in the methods they used to keep food from spoiling when warmth and time worked against them. And somewhere in those practices, quiet dangers waited beside every meal. Salt sat at the center of medieval survival, not as a luxury, but as a shield against hunger. People relied on it with a seriousness that came from centuries of repetition. Meat, fish, and even certain vegetables were pressed into layers of coarse crystals. each application meant to draw out moisture and slow decay. The process looked simple from a distance, yet it carried the weight of entire seasons. Without salt, the stored food would collapse into rot long before winter reached its harshest point. Every household understood this, and every village treated salt not as a seasoning, but as a silent guardian. When fresh meat was available, the work began immediately. Cuts were laid out on boards that had already known years of use, their surfaces scarred by knives and stained by brine from older seasons. Salt was rubbed into every fold and joint until the flesh stiffened under the pressure. People checked the pieces repeatedly, adding more crystals whenever moisture surfaced. The transformation was quick and unglamorous. Red flesh darkened to dull browns, and once soft textures hardened into something closer to stone. Nobody expected tenderness. Preservation mattered more than taste. By the time the pieces were hung to dry, they were almost unrecognizable from the animals they had come from. Fish required even harsher treatment. Entire catches were covered in layers of salt so thick that hands burned after hours of work. The salt pulled the life from the fish, shrinking them into dense slabs that could survive long journeys or long winters. Those who lived near the coast depended on this method to trade with distant towns, carrying barrels packed with salted fish that could last months without spoiling. Inland villages considered these barrels valuable, sometimes valuing them above tools or clothing. The salt was never wasted. Once the fish had taken in enough, the leftover crystals were dried and reused. A small effort to stretch a limited supply. Vegetables that could withstand the process, like cabbage or certain roots, also found their place in the salty stores of winter. While they did not keep as long as meat or fish, the brine changed their structure enough to delay the creeping advance of decay. Jars of salted greens sat in dark corners of homes, their contents pale and limp, but still edible when the cold stripped away fresh food entirely. Once winter tightened its grip, these jars became reminders that even the smallest preserved item could decide whether a family endured or faltered. The physical result of salting was rarely pleasant. Meat cured in this way was so hard that knives struggled to cut through it. People soaked it for hours to wash away enough salt to make the food chewable. Even then, the flavor remained sharp and aggressive. Fish could be equally unforgiving, their surfaces brittle and their interiors dense with salt. Meals made from these ingredients filled the stomach but never offered comfort. Families ate them with quiet acceptance, knowing the alternative was starvation. Complaints had no place at the table. The season demanded practicality over preference. Salt itself became a kind of currency. Villagers stored it in heavy sacks or sealed pots, guarding it against dampness and theft. A household with ample salt held an advantage that others recognized immediately. In times of scarcity, people traded small amounts for favors, tools, or help in the fields. The mineral carried an unspoken authority, shaping relationships within the community. Wealth did not depend solely on land or livestock. It depended on the ability to keep food intact when the world outside turned unforgiving. For travelers passing through, the reliance on salt seemed extreme. They wondered why so much effort was spent transforming food into something so tough and harsh. But the villagers saw the matter differently. They remembered winters when supplies ran out, when preserved meat softened too quickly, when fish spoiled before the cold had fully arrived. Salt was the only barrier between order and desperation. Every handful used in autumn was a promise for the months ahead. Even the air carried reminders of its importance. The smell of drying, salted meat lingered in homes throughout the season, mixing with smoke from low fires and dampness from the cold. It was not pleasant, but it was reassuring. As long as the smell remained, it meant the food was holding. It meant the preparations had worked. Survival had a scent, and people learned to accept it without question. These practices reveal how deeply salt shaped the rhythm of survival in harsh seasons. Another layer of understanding emerges when the focus shifts to the methods that kept food dry and safe when fire and wind were the only tools available. And within those methods lies a quiet attention that marked every household's attempt to endure the winter's weight. Drying food was one of the simplest tasks in appearance. Yet it carried a level of importance that shaped daily routines across entire communities. Meat, fish, and fruit were exposed to the sun or placed near steady heat until their moisture vanished, leaving behind pieces that were lighter, tougher, and capable of surviving long stretches of time. The method required no rare materials, no large stores of salt, and no complicated tools. What it demanded instead was patience, favourable weather, and a quiet vigilance that stayed with people from morning until night. The work began as soon as the season allowed, because drying depended entirely on days when the sun was strong enough to finish what hands had started. Fresh meat was cut into strips, each one thin enough for the heat to reach its centre. These strips were laid across racks or hung from wooden poles set up in open spaces. When the air was dry and the wind steady, the process moved quickly, tightening the fibres and turning the colour from deep reds to muted browns. Flies hovered constantly, testing the edges, but smoke from nearby fires discouraged them. Families watched these strips with a cautious discipline. Losing even a portion of the harvest to insects or sudden rain meant weakening their chances for winter. Each piece that dried successfully became a small, quiet reassurance that the coming season might be endured. Fish followed a similar pattern, especially in coastal villages where large catches needed to be preserved immediately. The bodies were cleaned, split open, and arranged in wide layers under the sun. Their smell drifted across the shoreline, a constant reminder that food was being transformed rather than wasted. Nets hung nearby to deter birds, and children were often tasked with waving away anything that tried to land. The work felt endless but necessary. Once dried, the fish became stiff and light, capable of lasting months or even years if kept in a dry place. These pieces were traded far inland, their durability making them valuable to towns where fresh seafood was rare. Fruit presented a gentler challenge. Apples, plums, and pears were sliced into thin rounds and spread across cloth or baskets. Over days, their surfaces shrank and darkened as moisture left them. What remained was sweet, resilient, and far easier to store than the fragile fresh versions. Dried fruit became a treasured resource in winter, not because of luxury, but because it offered a rare contrast to the harsh flavours of preserved meat and grain. Even the smallest pieces carried a faint memory of the warmer months, and families treated them with care that bordered on reverence. Inside the home, preservation shifted from sunlight to rising smoke. Many houses had beams running beneath their roofs, where meat, fish, and even herbs could be tied and suspended. Fires burned almost constantly, their smoke drifting upward in soft layers. Over time, the smoke coated everything, keeping insects away and slowly drawing moisture from the food. The placement above the fire also kept the items warm, though not hot enough to cook them. This slow drying produced foods that held firm throughout winter, becoming essential parts of daily meals. Villagers grew so accustomed to the sight of hanging strips and bundles that bare rafters felt unsettling, as if the home were missing a part of its structure. Some communities built small drying houses, simple constructions with raised platforms and controlled airflow. These structures operated even when the weather outside was unreliable. People fed small fires beneath the platforms, their smoke drying the meat from below, while vents directed the flow of heat. Work inside these houses was quiet and repetitive. The fires had to remain steady, never too strong, never too weak. Workers checked the pieces often, rotating them so that all sides dried evenly. While the process required attention, it allowed villages to dry large amounts of food at once, increasing their security before winter arrived. The final results of drying were rarely pleasant in texture. Meat became rigid and required soaking before cooking. Fish could splinter under a blade. Fruit lost its softness, turning leathery and dense. But none of these qualities mattered. People valued dried food because it survived when nothing else could. It fit into sacks, hung from beams, and stacked into baskets. It did not rot easily. It assured families that even when snow covered the ground, and when the stores ran low, there would still be something to chew, something to boil, something to carry them through the lingering cold. These drying practices reveal how closely people lived with the elements that shaped their survival. Another part of the story emerges when the focus turns to the smoke-filled rafters and the quiet corners where food gained protection from time and insects. In those shadows waits a deeper understanding of the subtle threats that accompanied every preserved meal. Spoiled food was not an exception in medieval life. It was a quiet certainty that settled into every household long before winter arrived. People learned to look past discoloration, changes in smell, and textures that no longer resembled the freshness of earlier days. What mattered was not whether the food was ideal, but whether it was still possible to consume. The margin between acceptable and unacceptable was narrow, shaped more by necessity than caution. Families approached their meals with an understanding that time altered everything, and the signs of spoilage were simply part of what it meant to survive without reliable storage. When bread began to grow patches of mold, no one reacted with alarm. A knife scraped across the surface, removing the green or white layer in a single motion. The remaining portion was considered safe enough, especially if it was intended for boiling or soaking. People repeated this action so often that it became routine, a gesture carried out without thought. Mold was not the enemy. Hunger was. As long as the interior remained firm, the bread continued to serve its purpose. Only when it softened into a damp collapse did families reluctantly discard it. And even then, animals might receive the remnants so that nothing went entirely to waste. Meat presented a more complex challenge. Even when salted or dried, it could develop odors that signaled slow decay. Instead of being thrown away, these pieces were placed into pots with strong ingredients: onions, vinegar, pepper, or whatever spices a household could spare. The mixture masked what the nose detected, turning the unpleasant into something merely intense. Cooking fires simmered for hours, breaking down toughness and blending harsh scents into manageable flavors. This approach did not erase the reality of spoilage, but it allowed families to extend the usefulness of meat long after its prime had passed. For most, this was not a choice, but a necessity dictated by limited resources. Fish experienced similar treatment. Dried fish sometimes absorbed moisture from damp air, softening at the edges or developing a faint sourness. Instead of seeing these changes as a warning, people approached them with adjustment. The fish would be rinsed thoroughly, boiled with herbs, or fried until the edges crisped. These methods transformed the smell enough to make the meal tolerable. In inland villages, where fish was a rare treasure, even the most questionable pieces were salvaged. The distance from the coast made any preserved fish too valuable to discard. Acceptance was woven into the culture of eating. Vegetables that had wilted or begun to ferment slightly were also kept. Cabbages with darkened edges were trimmed. Root vegetables with soft spots were cut into usable chunks. A certain level of decay was simply expected. Households could not afford to maintain the strict standards that modern kitchens rely on. Instead, they developed an instinctive knowledge of what could still be consumed without immediate harm. Their tolerance did not come from ignorance, but from experience across generations. Where caution coexisted with necessity, the environment inside medieval homes offered no help. Smoke, damp air, and pests influenced every stored item. Food that sat too close to the floor risked contamination from insects or rodents. Items hung near the rafters absorbed smoke until their surfaces turned dark. Jars sealed with cloth allowed small insects to slip through. Under such conditions, spoilage moved quickly. and people adapted by recognizing what could still be used. To them, food was not judged by ideal conditions but by possibility. Anything that retained structure and could endure boiling was considered acceptable. Spices played a subtle but important role. While expensive, even small quantities could alter the flavor of compromised food. Pepper added heat that distracted the tongue from bitterness. Vinegar sharpened the profile enough to mask faint sourness. Onions brought strength that overwhelmed mild decay. Families used these ingredients with care, knowing they could stretch meals into something more bearable. The goal was never to restore freshness. It was to create something that could be swallowed without discomfort. Visitors from wealthier households sometimes recoiled at these practices, yet they were grounded in reality. For poorer families, wasting food was unthinkable. Weather, pests, and unpredictable harvests ensured that every edible scrap held value. Even questionable items were preserved through boiling or frying, both methods capable of transforming the unappealing into something functional. Illness was common, but people rarely attributed it to food. Diseases spread through water, air, and cramped conditions, making it difficult to identify the true cause of sickness. Spoilage became a familiar companion rather than a threat. Households treated these realities with resignation rather than fear. Children grew accustomed to meals with harsh smells or uneven textures. Adults accepted that what they ate was shaped by forces beyond their control. Each family understood that the true luxury was not having fresh food. It was having enough food to reach the next season. Appearance mattered little. Taste mattered less. Survival depended on flexibility, not preference. These attitudes towards spoiled food reveal a world where endurance overshadowed caution. Something deeper becomes visible when attention shifts to the jars and barrels where vegetables fermented deliberately, creating foods that lasted long after freshness disappeared. Within those vessels lies another form of adaptation that shaped daily survival in ways both practical and unexpected. Fermentation entered medieval homes as quietly as any everyday task. Yet its influence reached far beyond the jars and earthen vessels where vegetables transformed. People relied on this method because fresh produce vanished quickly after harvest, leaving long months when the ground yielded nothing edible. Cabbage, or turnips, onions, and other hardy vegetables were salted, submerged, and left to change under conditions that seemed simple but demanded careful preparation. The goal was not to create a flavorful dish, but to preserve what little nourishment the land provided. In a world shaped by scarcity, fermented vegetables became an anchor that helped families withstand the slow erosion of winter. The process began shortly after the harvest, when vegetables were still crisp and full of moisture. Women and older children washed the pieces in cold water and sliced them into manageable sizes. Salt was sprinkled generously over each layer, drawing liquid from the vegetables until they softened. This brine formed naturally, becoming the environment where fermentation could begin. Everything was packed tightly into jars or clay vats, leaving as little air as possible. The vessels were then sealed with cloth or wooden lids and carried to a place where the temperature remained steady. Most homes chose their cellars or the shaded corners beside the hearth, where warmth or coolness shifted predictably with the seasons. Inside the vessels, the transformation unfolded slowly and invisibly. Wild bacteria fed on the sugars within the vegetables, releasing acids that preserved the contents. People understood none of the science, yet recognized the signs that the process was working. Bubbles rose to the surface of the brine. The smell sharpened, growing sour but controlled. The vegetables shrank slightly as the liquid level climbed. These changes, familiar to every seasoned household, offered reassurance. Once the initial fermentation settled, the jars could last months or even years if kept sealed. Families counted on this reliability with a quiet trust, shaped by generations of repetition. The placement of the jars mattered. In cellars, darkness and cooler temperatures slowed the breakdown, allowing the vegetables to retain structure longer. These spaces, often damp and lined with stone, kept the jars safe from insects and animals. But in homes without cellars, fermentation took place near the hearth. The warmth quickened the process, producing stronger flavors and requiring more frequent checking. Households adjusted instinctively, tightening cloth covers, wiping away moisture, and occasionally skimming the surface when stray debris accumulated. Even the smoke from the hearth contributed indirectly, deterring insects and giving the vessels an environment that felt protected, if imperfect. As winter deepened, fermented vegetables took on a practical significance that fresh produce could never match. Their sourness cut through the monotony of salted and dried foods. The texture, though softened, offered contrast to the dense bread and hardened meat that filled most meals. More importantly, these vegetables retained nutrients that other methods stripped away. Families who consumed them regularly suffered less from ailments associated with deficiency. They did not speak of vitamins or medical causes. They simply observed that people who ate these preserved vegetables retained strength through the colder months. Among the poor, this difference meant fewer collapses from exhaustion and fewer unexplained deaths when the season reached its harsh point. In many villages, the vessels themselves reflected the value placed on fermentation. Some were inherited, their surfaces darkened by years of use. Others were purchased during rare moments of surplus. Clay jars, though fragile, offered consistent results. Wooden barrels could hold larger quantities. Households that managed to fill multiple vessels earned a quiet respect within the community, as their preparations hinted at competence and foresight. The sight of these containers lined against cellar walls brought a sense of security that few other possessions could match. These jars were not symbols of wealth, they were the foundation of endurance. Despite its importance, fermentation required little discussion. It was neither celebrated nor questioned. People simply accepted it as one of the few reliable defenses against the uncertainty of seasons. Even children understood the significance of the jars. They learned not to disturb them, not to lift the lids, and not to knock over the vessels when playing. A cracked jar meant lost food, and lost food meant risk. Every home carried stories of winters when a single accident forced a family to rely more heavily on neighbors than pride allowed. These lessons shaped behavior long before the children understood the meaning of hunger. Travelers encountering fermented vegetables for the first time often reacted with hesitation. The smell was sharp and unfamiliar. The texture seemed foreign compared with fresh produce. Yet, these vegetables appeared consistently at mealtimes because they remained one of the few items that withstood the challenges of long winters. People did not view the sourness as unpleasant. They viewed it as evidence that the food had survived. Survival shaped taste just as it shaped everything else in the medieval world. Fermentation also influenced communal habits. Villagers sometimes worked together to prepare large batches, sharing salt and labor when harvests permitted. These gatherings created brief moments of cooperation before the cold, fractured daily routines. Once the jars were sealed, families returned to their separate lives, carrying with them the knowledge that their preparations might determine their fate in the coming months. Even in communities with shared responsibilities, survival remained an individual matter. The jars offered reassurance, but they also reminded everyone of what could go wrong. By spring, the remaining fermented vegetables often tasted stronger. Their flavors deepened by age, but they were still edible. And that alone justified the method. When fresh plants emerged again, the jars were emptied, cleaned, and prepared for the next cycle. The pattern repeated annually, shaping the rhythm of the household in ways that were almost invisible, yet profoundly necessary. These vessels of preserved vegetables reveal how families fought quietly against the passing of seasons. Another layer of daily struggle appears when attention shifts to the jars sealed with oil, vinegar, or honey, where food endured under a different form of protection. Inside those mixtures rests a method shaped by need and sharpened by desperation. Preserving food, by submerging it in oil. Vinegar or honey offered households a different kind of defense against decay, one that required careful handling and a sense of timing shaped by long habit. These liquids altered the environment around the food, slowing the advance of spoilage and creating barriers that air and insects could not easily breach. The method demanded ingredients that were not always abundant, yet families used whatever quantities they could spare. The goal was simple: extend the life of food that might otherwise disappear before the winter reached its peak. In a world constantly pressed by scarcity, every jar filled in this way represented one more chance to endure. Oil was the most straightforward medium. Vegetables, then herbs, and even small cuts of meat were submerged completely, their surfaces forced below a layer of liquid that sealed out air. The oil did not stop time, but it slowed the changes that threatened the food. As long as nothing broke the surface, mold struggled to gain hold. People checked these jars frequently, pushing down stray pieces that tried to rise. The texture of the preserved food shifted gradually, becoming softer and more saturated. Eating it required adjusting expectations. The flavors grew muted while the oil added heaviness. Yet even with these changes, the food remained edible long after it would have spoiled if left exposed. Vinegar offered a sharper form of protection. Its acidity subdued the growth of bacteria and neutralized the early signs of decay. Households often chose vinegar for items that spoiled quickly, such as onions, soft vegetables, or leftover meat that could not be dried or salted in time. When submerged, these foods took on the liquid sourness, transforming into meals that were intense but safe. The smell, harsh and unmistakable, drifted from the jars whenever they were opened. People accepted it without complaint. Vinegar provided reliability, and reliability mattered far more than comfort. Even the poorest families tried to keep at least one small jar filled, knowing it might become valuable during the colder months. Honey preserves food through a different mechanism: thick, heavy, and resistant to moisture. It enclosed small fruits or herbs in a dense barrier that protected them from the outside world. Honey was expensive, making this method rare among villagers. Yet those who could afford it valued the results. Fruits soaked in honey held their shape and color longer than those dried or salted. Their sweetness cut through the monotony of winter meals, offering brief moments of relief. Even households unable to spare full jars sometimes used honey to coat small batches of food, hoping to make precious items last just a little longer. Honey's ability to slow decay made it almost magical in the eyes of villagers, though its scarcity kept it from becoming a widespread solution. No matter the liquid used, storage determined success. Jars were often buried halfway in the ground, where soil kept them cool and shielded them from sudden temperature changes. The earth acted as a natural insulator, preventing the liquids from spoiling or fermenting too quickly. Families chose shaded corners of their yards or dug shallow pits beside their homes. Some marked the locations with stones to avoid accidentally disturbing the jars. Others preferred hiding them, fearing theft in times of desperation. Despite their differences, all households depended on the stability that the ground provided. Without it, the jars would warm unpredictably, and the food inside would deteriorate long before it was needed. The jars themselves varied. Clay vessels offered the most consistent results because their porous walls helped maintain stable temperatures. Wooden containers absorbed some of the liquids, darkening over time and taking on the scent of whatever they held. Glass jars existed but were rare, valued for allowing families to see the condition of the food without opening the lid. Regardless of the container, sealing the top was critical. Cloth, waxed leather, wooden lids, or clay stoppers kept insects out and limited exposure to air. Any failure in the seal, however small, invites mold or rot, turning an entire jar into waste. Inside households, These preserved foods became part of winter routines. Meals built around dried or salted ingredients were often supplemented with small portions taken from jars buried outside. A spoonful of vinegar-soaked vegetables added acidity. A bit of oil-preserved meat offered richness. A piece of honey-covered fruit softened the harshness of dried bread. Each addition reminded families that they had taken steps to prepare for the cold season. The jars represented planning, effort, and the fragile hope that their stores would last. For travelers unaccustomed to these methods, the sight of buried jars or strongly scented contents seemed strange. They could not understand why people accepted such intense flavors or unusual textures. But these visitors did not face the same constraints. They moved from place to place, buying fresh food when available. For villagers tied to the land, preservation meant more than convenience. It meant survival. The methods were not judged by taste, but by durability. As long as the food remained safe to eat, the process was considered successful. Season after season, households repeated the same rituals. They sliced, submerged, sealed, and buried. They checked jars during the first frosts and during the thaw. They relied on these stores during weeks when nothing else remained. The liquids changed slowly, darkening or thickening as time passed. But the food endured. This endurance shaped the rhythm of life in ways that few people outside these villages could appreciate. These submerged stores reveal how necessity shaped every choice in food preservation. Another side of that struggle emerges when attention turns to the grains and breads that carried households through the longest months, where durability mattered more than flavor. Such staples expose a different layer of endurance that defined medieval survival. Grains formed the backbone of medieval survival, shaping the rhythms of daily life far more than meat or vegetables ever could. Barley, oats, and wheat determined whether a household faced winter with confidence or apprehension. These crops resisted decay longer than most foods, making them essential to communities forced to rely on whatever could endure months of cold and scarcity. Stored in ceramic jars, clay vessels, or woven sacks hung high from rafters, grains offered a quiet reassurance that did not depend on weather or luck. Their presence bound seasons together, turning harvest into continuity rather than a fleeting moment of abundance. Harvest time brought urgency. Families worked in fields from dawn until dusk, gathering stalks before rain or wind could damage them. Once cut, the grains were threshed, winnowed, and dried with meticulous care. Any moisture left behind could ruin an entire season's supply. People spread the kernels across cloths or flat stones, watching them closely as the sun drew out the last traces of dampness. When they judged the grains ready, they poured them into sturdy containers, heavy ceramic jars sealed with cloth or wax, or clay pots stacked in corners where pests struggled to reach. These vessels absorbed the earthy smell of stored grain, a scent that lingered year-round and came to represent security itself. Despite these protections, pests remained constant threats. Weevils and beetles found their way into sacks, laying eggs that hatched unnoticed until small holes appeared in the kernels. Villagers rarely considered this contamination a reason for waste. As long as the grains remained mostly intact, they were rinsed, sifted, and used. The insects were simply removed, their presence accepted as another inconvenience of life, rather than a danger. Only when the infestation became overwhelming did a household consider discarding a portion. Even then, the decision was reluctant, shaped by the knowledge that lost grain meant slimmer rations during the harsher months. Bread emerged from these grains as the most reliable daily food, baked during periods of warmth and stored during colder months. The loaves hardened quickly. Fresh bread was a luxury. Most families ate versions that had grown firm and dry. These loaves, often dense and dark, needed soaking to become chewable again. People softened them in broth, al, or water heated over small fires. Once revived, the bread absorbed the flavors of the liquid, making it more palatable. Meals built around these softened pieces were simple yet filling, providing the calories needed to work through long days. Bread's durability mattered more than its taste, and its ability to survive weeks or months made it indispensable. In times of scarcity, even crumbs were saved. Families collected every hardened piece, storing them in cloth bags or wooden boxes until enough accumulated to create a meal. These fragments were boiled into thick porridges or added to soups to increase volume. No part of the loaf was wasted, and the practice of reusing stale bread became an unspoken rule that shaped household habits. The poor depended on these practices heavily, but even wealthier homes followed them out of tradition and caution. Bread represented stability in a world where most foods slipped quickly into decay. Porridge, made from oats or barley, supplemented or replaced bread when supplies ran low. These grains, boiled slowly with water or milk when available, produced a thick, plain dish that sustained both children and adults. Though monotonous, porridges were adaptable. Families added dried herbs, bits of salted meat, or small amounts of fermented vegetables when they could spare them. The consistency changed depending on the day's resources. Sometimes the porridge was thin, almost watery. Other times it was heavy and dense. Regardless of form, it filled the stomach and offered the slow-burning energy needed to continue labor. Throughout the winter, the presence of grains shaped household confidence. People calculated how much remained by lifting jars, probing the depth with wooden spoons, or shaking sacks gently to listen for movement. These assessments occurred regularly, especially as the season reached its midpoint. A dwindling supply meant stricter portions. A fuller store brought a fleeting sense of comfort, but no family assumed safety. A single spoiled container or miscalculation could shift their prospects abruptly. Grain supplies rarely ran out completely, but they often reached uncomfortable lows that forced people to depend more heavily on broths and vegetables preserved through other methods. The connection between grains and survival extended beyond food. Families used straw left from harvest to insulate their homes or fill bedding. Chaff fed animals during lean months, helping them produce milk or remain fit for labor. The harvest supported life from multiple directions, and each part contributed to the fragile balance that governed rural existence. Grain cultivation demanded effort, but the outcome justified every hour spent under the sun. Travelers passing through villages saw barrels and bags stacked neatly in corners and assumed abundance. They did not see the calculation embedded in each household's storage. For villagers, grains were a measure of how much time they could endure without fear of hunger. Each jar sealed represented a barrier between security and desperation, a quiet hope wrapped in ordinary material. Bread and porridge did not bring pleasure, but they brought continuity. That continuity allowed people to face seasons that offered little else. These enduring staples reveal how communities built their survival on foods that resisted time. Another perspective emerges when attention shifts to the ways households masked decay in grand gatherings, where even the finest meals carried hidden compromises. Beneath those displays lies a tension that shaped medieval dining, far more than appearance suggested. Royal feasts were remembered for their spectacle, yet beneath the polished surfaces and elaborate decorations, the food often carried the unmistakable marks of decay. Without refrigeration, even the most carefully stored cuts of meat began to sour before reaching the kitchen. Courtiers admired overflowing platters and gilded trays, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, that many of these dishes had travelled too far, endured too much heat, or survived too many days without proper preservation. The grandeur of the setting concealed the truth that privilege did not protect anyone from the limits imposed by time and climate. Noble households relied on the same preservation methods as villagers, but distance, transport, and excess brought their own risks. When animals were slaughtered for large banquets, the meat moved quickly from the courtyard to the kitchen. But even hurried preparation could not erase the early signs of spoilage if the weather turned warm or if too many hours passed between butchering and cooking. Cooks worked in rooms thick with heat, where fires burned constantly and air circulation barely existed. These conditions accelerated decay, causing meat to soften, leak, or develop faint odours long before it reached the guests. Yet discarding such expensive goods was unthinkable. Every piece had to be salvaged, and that responsibility fell to those who understood the subtle art of masking flaws rather than eliminating them. Spices served as the first line of concealment. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon arrived from distant trade routes at enormous cost. Their presence in a dish signaled wealth, but their true purpose often remained unspoken. When meat carried unpleasant scents, cooks increased the quantity of spices, grinding them into heavy pastes or thick sauces that clung to every surface. These mixtures overpowered the nose and tongue, transforming questionable cuts into dishes that appeared rich and complex. The guests praised the flavours, unaware that their admiration arose from efforts to obscure decay rather than highlight quality. Vinegar and wine also played roles in this concealment. Sour liquids cut through the stronger odours of aging meat, while long simmering blended the ingredients into something that passed as deliberate culinary design. Boiling helped as well. The heat tightened textures and reduced visible signs of deterioration. Broths and stews, staples of noble kitchens, allowed cooks to repurpose meats that no longer held their shape. Floating herbs and colourful garnishes disguised inconsistencies. As long as the presentation remained elegant, few questioned the origins of the dish placed before them. Fish presented greater challenges. Transport from coastal villages took days, sometimes longer when roads turned muddy, or trade slowed. By the time the fish arrived at a noble household, it often bore the unmistakable scent of its journey. Yet fish appeared frequently at feasts, chosen for their symbolic meaning or seasonal availability. Cooks treated it like any other imperfect ingredient. They bathed it in strong herbs, stuffed it with onions, soaked it in wine, or covered it in sauces thickened with expensive spices. While these preparations impressed guests, they also masked the fact that the fish had already begun to break down. The contrast between appearance and reality defined such gatherings. Guests admired towering displays of roasted animals, their skins crisp and glistening. They marvelled at arrays of pastries, peas, and decorated platters arranged with careful symmetry. But behind the scenes, kitchen workers scraped away blemishes, trimmed discoloured portions, and handled ingredients that strained the limits of edibility. They understood the demands of presentation, and they knew that their labour determined whether the feast would impress or disgust its attendees. Their skill lay in creating perfection, but in hiding imperfection skillfully enough that nobody looked too closely. Even the wealthiest households faced these challenges as well. Access to spices, wine, and imported goods did not change the nature of perishable food. Once spoilage began, no amount of wealth could reverse it. Instead, wealth provided tools to disguise the inevitable. Elaborate recipes emerged from these conditions, shaped by necessity rather than creativity. Layers of flavour, once celebrated as culinary achievements, often existed primarily to conceal what time had already done to the ingredients. Guests rarely questioned what they consumed. In a world without refrigeration, everyone understood that freshness had limits. Nobles, accustomed to displays of opulence, believed that their status insulated them from the problems faced by common villagers. Yet the same forces of heat, to distance, and time affected them as surely as they affected those who lived in humble cottages. Spoilage crept into every household, regardless of wealth. The difference lay in how effectively it was hidden. This concealment raised risks. Some dishes caused discomfort or illness shortly after the feast, But these incidents blended into the general landscape of medieval health. People attributed sickness to air, humours, or chance, rather than the food that had delighted them moments earlier. Deaths occurred occasionally, but rarely with enough consistency for anyone to draw meaningful conclusions. In a society where disease and contamination were constant companions, spoiled food became just another hazard among many. What lingered in the aftermath of such feasts was not the memory of flavour but the memory of spectacle. People spoke of the musicians, the decorations, the candles burning late into the night. They admired the wealth on display and the mastery of the cooks. Few ever paused to consider the truth behind the dishes, or the quiet labour that transformed decaying ingredients into something presentable. The grandeur of the feast overshadowed everything else. These ornate gatherings reveal how presentation overshadowed reality in the struggle against decay. Another glimpse into daily survival appears when attention turns to the overwhelming reliance on spices, where flavour disguised danger as effectively as any royal display. Beneath that reliance lies a fragile balance between necessity and illusion. Spices entered medieval kitchens with an authority that far outweighed their small size, shaping meals not through refinement but through necessity. Cloves, pepper, nutmeg, and other imported ingredients were valued less for their taste than for their ability to mask decay. Their sharp aromas cut through the odours that rose from aging meat, softened vegetables, or fish that had travelled too far inland. In wealthy households, spices became symbols of status. Yet beneath the surface, they served a far more practical role. They stood between diners and the unmistakable truth of food nearing the end of its usability. When cooks reached for these spices, they did so with a measured urgency. A pot of stew might already carry sour undertones, softened by long simmering, but still detectable. Salt had preserved the meat for months, yet time had left its mark. In such cases, pepper was added in quantities large enough to sting the tongue. Cloves were ground into pastes that overwhelmed the senses. Nutmeg was shaved into broths until the smell of rot faded beneath its complexity. These additions created dishes that seemed rich, layered, and even indulgent. But the effect came from concealment rather than inspiration. The spices worked to override what nature had already begun. The cost of these ingredients meant that only the nobility could rely on them regularly. Merchants transported spices across continents, through deserts and seas, each journey raising their value. By the time they reached medieval markets, their prices placed them firmly out of reach for most households. Villagers scraped by with salt, onions, or vinegar, while nobles possessed entire chests of rare spices. This division created a culinary landscape in which flavour depended not on preference but on wealth. Households with access to spices transformed questionable ingredients into meals that appeared refined. Those without such resources learned to tolerate harsh odours and flavours because they had no other choice. In noble kitchens, spices shaped every dish that passed through the hands of servants. Even fresh meat received generous coatings of pepper or cloves because consistency mattered more than honesty. Guests expected rich aromas at feasts, and spices delivered them reliably. When meat had begun to break down, cooks used even heavier quantities, repeating the process until the original scent disappeared beneath layers of spice. The resulting dishes became predictable, intensely seasoned, strong enough to suggest abundance, and incapable of revealing their true condition. Flavour did not emerge from the ingredient, but from the need to disguise it. The perception of quality became distorted in this environment. People praised the dishes not because they recognized the ingredients, but because the force of the spices impressed them. A heavily seasoned stew might come from meat just hours away from spoiling, yet diners interpreted the bold flavors as signs of skill. Over time, this relationship between spice and decay became ingrained. The more intense the seasoning, the greater the suspicion about the ingredient beneath it. Nobles understood this privately. Yet they maintained the illusion publicly because appearances shaped their world. A well-seasoned dish upheld the household's reputation, even if the ingredients carried flaws. The association between spices and wealth further distorted the truth. Guests admired the host's ability to procure rare goods, unaware that these goods often hid what they most wished to avoid. Spices became both protection and adornment. They covered imperfections while reinforcing social hierarchies. Their scarcity meant that households rationed them carefully, saving them for occasions when the food's condition demanded intervention. Rarely were spices used plainly or sparingly. Their purpose was not subtle enhancement, but domination, forcing the senses to accept what the eyes and nose might otherwise reject. Meals prepared with these spices were often overwhelming. Pepper produced heat that masked bitterness. Cloves left numbing sensations on the tongue. Nutmeg filled the air with a heavy sweetness that clung to clothing. These sensations became familiar in noble circles. Yet they also created expectations that widened the gap between classes. Wealthier families grew accustomed to food that carried strong, elaborate flavors. Poorer families relied on simplicity, eating meals that revealed their ingredients plainly. This contrast did not reflect preference but the reality of resources. Despite their ability to conceal decay, spices did not erase danger completely. Some meat spoiled too quickly, turning slimy or sour beyond rescue. Spices could hide the smell, but they could not reverse the chemical changes within the food. Illness followed such meals quietly. People blamed the air, the season, or misfortune rather than the ingredients themselves. This misattribution persisted across generations, allowing the cycle to continue. Spices remained tools of reassurance, offering the illusion of safety even when none existed. Cooks understood these risks intimately. Their work placed them between expectation and truth, forcing them to judge when a dish could still be saved and when it should be abandoned. Their decisions carried consequences, yet the pressure to present abundance often outweighed caution. Spices allowed them to push boundaries that would otherwise have been unacceptable. They became experts at layering scents and flavors to create something that met the demands of noble households, even when the ingredients came dangerously close to failure. In the end, the heavy use of spices shaped medieval dining into something far removed from modern ideas of cuisine. Flavor became not an art but a shield. Appearance mattered more than authenticity. Meals reflected survival disguised as luxury, turning necessity into ritual. The stronger the spice, the deeper the concealment, and the more elaborate the illusion of control over a world where food spoiled faster than status allowed people to admit. These seasoned dishes reveal how illusions replaced freshness in the struggle to maintain dignity at the table. Another dimension becomes clear when attention shifts to the fragile foods that spoiled fastest, where even the simplest items carried risks impossible to ignore. Such fragility exposes the vulnerability hidden beneath medieval households' daily routines. Milk entered medieval households as a substance both valued and feared, carrying with it a fragility that few other foods possessed. Once drawn from the animal, it began to change almost immediately. Warmth encouraged souring, movement stirred separation, and even the cleanest containers struggled to keep it stable for long. Families learned that milk demanded quick decisions: drink it at once, transform it into butter, or set it aside to become cheese. Delay meant waste, and waste meant risk. In a world where food rarely lasted, milk's impermanence made it both precious and unpredictable. Fresh milk was consumed only when circumstances allowed. People drank it early in the morning, when the cool air helped slow the process of spoilage. Even then, the liquid carried traces of the animal and the environment, faint flavors that varied with seasons and feed. If the day grew warm or the container sat too long, the milk began to sour, forming clumps and releasing smells that signaled its decline. Some households used this souring deliberately, turning milk into curds or simple cheeses. Others lacked the resources or knowledge to manage these transformations and watched the milk spoil before they could decide how to save it. Butter offered one solution: churning separated fat from liquid, producing a substance that resisted spoilage longer. Yet butter carried its own demands. It required steady labor, cool storage, and careful handling to prevent rancidity. Households with stone cellars or shaded storage areas fared better, but those without such spaces struggled to keep butter edible. When it softened too quickly or absorbed the smells of surrounding foods, its quality deteriorated rapidly. Even so, people accepted its instability because it offered a brief extension of milk's usefulness, turning something fleeting into something that could survive a few extra days. Cheese provided a more reliable transformation. By adding rennet, heat, or acids, households encouraged milk to curdle in controlled ways. The resulting curds were pressed and salted, forming shapes that hardened with time. Semi-soft cheeses lasted weeks, while harder varieties endured entire seasons. The flavor deepened as the cheese aged, sometimes pleasantly, other times less so. But age was a minor concern compared to longevity. Families relied on cheese because it offered nutrition long after the original milk had disappeared. Even flawed wheels were consumed unless mold or decay grew too strong to ignore. Eggs presented a different challenge. Fresh eggs lasted longer than milk, but remained vulnerable to heat, moisture, and rough handling. Households collected them carefully, storing them in cool corners or coating their shells in substances that slowed air exchange. Cooking provided the most dependable protection. Boiled eggs resisted spoilage longer, especially when kept in their shells. Some families salted or pickled eggs, extending their usefulness across seasons. These methods changed the texture and flavor, yet they created food that endured beyond the limits of the fresh version. People embraced such transformations because they could not afford to lose even small sources of protein. Improper storage carried consequences that households recognized, even without understanding the underlying causes. Milk left too warm caused stomach cramps, vomiting, or prolonged illness. Children suffered most, their smaller bodies unable to withstand the sudden shock. Adults accepted these dangers as part of daily life, rarely attributing sickness directly to spoiled milk. Some believed the illness came from an imbalance or contaminated water, while others treated it as a seasonal misfortune. Regardless of belief, the pattern repeated itself year after year. Eggs that spoiled created similar risks. If cracks went unnoticed, or if the egg absorbed moisture, its contents turned foul. Eating one brought immediate discomfort. Yet identifying which eggs were unsafe required experience rather than certainty. The environment inside medieval homes worsened these vulnerabilities. Kitchens were warm, smoky, and crowded. Storage spaces were limited, often shared with grains, vegetables, or preserved meats. Animals moved freely around the home in poorer households, increasing the likelihood of contamination. Containers varied in quality, from porous clay vessels to wooden buckets that absorbed odors and bacteria. Even those who cleaned their tools regularly faced conditions that prevented true sanitation. Milk and eggs simply existed in a state of constant tension with their surroundings. Despite the risks, these foods remained essential. Milk fed children when other foods ran scarce, and eggs provided a compact form of nourishment that required little preparation. Households accepted the hazards because the benefits outweighed the dangers. They adapted through routine, turning fragile ingredients into more stable forms whenever possible. What today might seem careless or dangerous reflected practical knowledge shaped by centuries of trial and error. Survival depended on using every available resource, even when those resources carried hidden threats. For visitors with greater wealth, the fragility of these foods signaled the difference between comfort and hardship. Wealthier households often had access to cooler storage spaces, finer containers, and a larger variety of food, reducing their reliance on milk and eggs. For the poor, these items offered rare nutrition and occasional relief from monotonous diets. Yet the danger remained universal. No household, regardless of status, escaped the challenges posed by foods that spoiled faster than they could be consumed. Across towns and villages, milk and eggs marked the narrow threshold between nourishment and illness. Families relied on their consistency, yet feared their unpredictability. Each day required renewed judgment, whether to use them immediately, transform them quickly, or risk holding them longer. In that tension, medieval households revealed their dependence on foods that could just as easily sustain as harm. These fragile ingredients reveal how quickly nourishment could shift into danger. Another pattern emerges when attention turns to the drinks that replaced water at nearly every table, where low alcohol content offered a safer path through daily life. This reliance illuminates how deeply survival shaped even the smallest habits of medieval households. Water in medieval settlements existed in a state of constant suspicion. Wells stood at the center of villages. Streams cut through fields, and rainwater collected in barrels. Yet none of these sources offered consistency or safety. Contamination arrived from livestock, waste, runoff, and the simple reality of overcrowded living spaces. People recognized the risks even without understanding their causes. They learned through experience that clear water did not guarantee purity, and that illness followed those who relied on it too often. As a result, households turned to weak beer and light wine as everyday necessities rather than indulgences. These drinks provided stability where water could not. Weak beer formed the foundation of daily hydration, brewed from grains and boiled before fermentation. It carried less danger than untreated water. The brewing process removed impurities, and the low alcohol content kept the drink mild enough for all ages. Even children consumed it regularly, sipping from cups at mealtimes or drinking diluted portions throughout the day. The taste was familiar, earthy, and often monotonous. Yet families accepted it because the alternative felt unpredictable. Beer became not an escape from hardship, but a reassurance against unseen threats. Many households brewed small batches several times a week, maintaining a cycle that aligned with their stores of grain. The brewing process itself was shaped by practicality. Women oversaw most of the work, grinding grains, heating water, stirring mash, and waiting for yeast to perform its silent transformation. The results varied in strength and flavor, influenced by weather, grain quality, and timing, but even inconsistent batches served their purpose. Weak beer spoiled more slowly than plain water and resisted contamination longer. Households stored it in clay jugs, wooden casks, or leather bottles, using it steadily until the next brew replaced it. The drink became woven into the rhythm of domestic life, as ordinary as bread or broth. Light wine played a similar role in regions where grapes grew or where trade routes brought barrels into towns. It carried sharper flavors and higher alcohol content than weak beer, yet it remained mild by modern standards. People diluted it with water to stretch the supply and soften the acidity. This mixture reduced the risks associated with both components. Water gained some protection from fermentation, and wine lost its harsh edge. Families used wine not only for drinking, but also for cooking, cleaning, and preserving. Its acidity masked imperfections in food and helped reduce the smell of aging meat. Both beer and wine contributed indirectly to the preservation of other foods. Liquid from brewing could be used to moisten dry bread, softening loaves that had grown too hard to chew. Light wine served as a medium for soaking spoiled meat or vegetables, letting acids disguise early signs of rot. People found comfort in the idea that these drinks, already central to their diet, could also rescue meals that might otherwise be abandoned. Even when the food retained hints of spoilage, the addition of alcohol offered reassurance. Whether this reassurance was deserved mattered less than the psychological security it provided. In many households, Weak beer replaced water from dawn until dusk. Workers carried small containers to fields. Craftsmen kept jugs beside their tools. And children drank from wooden cups without question. The warmth of the drink during colder months comforted families, while its slight chill in summer refreshed them more safely than river water. Illness still occurred, but far less frequently than when water served as the primary drink. People viewed beer and wine as reliable companions, shaped by effort, yet stabilized by processes they did not fully understand. The social implications of these habits extended beyond hydration. Brewing became a household skill that shaped reputations. Some families produced consistently pleasant batches, gaining quiet admiration from neighbors. Others struggled with inconsistent brews that turned sour quickly. Yet even flawed beer held value. It could still be consumed or repurposed for cooking. Waste rarely occurred, as every portion carried the memory of the labor invested in creating it. Brewing linked generations through shared methods, reinforcing traditions that supported survival. Children grew up assuming beer was normal. They drank it with meals, carried it in small containers, and associated it with comfort rather than indulgence. Wine appeared less frequently in ordinary households, reserved for illness, special occasions, or preservation. But its influence lingered in kitchens and storerooms, where its acidity played subtle roles in preventing food from spoiling too quickly. People did not label these uses as techniques or strategies. They simply repeated actions that had protected their families for generations. Visitors unfamiliar with medieval practices sometimes viewed the reliance on alcohol as indulgent or irresponsible. But this interpretation ignored the context. Water sources lacked regulation, protection, or understanding. Beer and wine offered predictability in environments defined by uncertainty. Their mild alcohol content rarely impaired anyone, and their integration into daily life reflected necessity rather than preference. In this world, safety emerged not from purity, but from process. Boiling, fermenting, and transforming unstable liquids into something that resisted contamination. The widespread use of these drinks illuminated the compromises medieval families made to survive. They accepted flavors shaped by yeast, grain, and fermentation because these flavors signaled safety. They monitored brewing vessels more closely than wells. They handed cups of weak beer to their children because it posed fewer risks than water drawn from unreliable sources. These choices did not reflect luxury, but adaptation. These habitual drinks reveal how deeply people depended on fermentation to protect themselves from invisible threats. Another contrast emerges when attention turns to the foods considered spoiled yet still consumed. Where tolerance pushed the boundaries of safety, this contrast exposes the uneasy relationship between necessity and risk that defined medieval eating. Meals in medieval households unfolded beneath a quiet tension that few acknowledged openly. Every dish, no matter how simple, carried a degree of uncertainty. People lacked the means to detect contamination, and even foods that looked clean could conceal dangers invisible to the eye. Mold, parasites, and bacteria lived comfortably in the same environments as the families who struggled to prepare their meals. Each bite offered nourishment, yet it also carried the possibility of illness. This uncertainty shaped daily life so thoroughly that people learned to accept it, not because they trusted their food, but because they had no alternatives. Even ingredients considered fresh presented risks. Vegetables pulled from the ground sometimes carried larvae or spores that clung to their skins. Cleaning helped, but never guaranteed safety. Meat from recently slaughtered animals could spoil faster than expected, especially in warm seasons. Fish arriving from distant waters began to decompose during transport, long before cooks attempted to rescue them with spices, vine, or smoke. Households recognized these signs, but lacked the knowledge to understand their causes. They relied on smell, texture, and appearance, though these indicators rarely told the full story. What seemed wholesome could still carry illness. The tools used in cooking further complicated matters. Wooden boards absorbed juices from meat and vegetables, darkening with use and harboring bacteria deep within their grain. Knives dulled by constant cutting tore rather than sliced, leaving fibers exposed where microbes thrived. Pots and pans sat beside hearths, coated in soot, while storage jars cracked over time. Allowing moisture to enter, families repaired what they could, cleaned what they were able, and continued cooking because survival demanded it. The imperfections of their tools mirrored the imperfections of their food. Illness often began subtly. A child complained of discomfort. An adult felt a sudden wave of fatigue. Or an elder grew faint after a meal. Stomach cramps followed, accompanied by fever or vomiting. These symptoms became familiar, repeating themselves across seasons and generations. People attributed them to imbalance, weather, or chance. Rarely did they connect the illness directly to the meal they had just shared. When several family members fell sick at once, suspicion grew, but certainty remained out of reach. The connection between food and disease lay hidden behind the limited understanding of the time. Parasites added another layer of risk. Worms lived in poorly cooked meat, in contaminated grains, and sometimes even in water. Their presence caused weight loss, weakness, and lingering discomfort. Households used herbs and broths to treat these conditions, though the remedies offered only temporary relief. People learned to endure these discomforts because they saw no way to avoid them entirely. Every family had stories of relatives struck by sudden illness after eating. Yet these stories blended into the background of a world where sickness was common, and explanations were scarce. Despite these dangers, mealtimes remained essential moments of gathering. Families sat together around wooden tables or shared bowls on the floor, eating slowly and speaking quietly. These moments did not eliminate the risks, but they softened them with familiarity. Eating became an act of resilience rather than certainty. People accepted the fragility of their food because refusing it meant hunger. In harsh seasons, especially winter, the need for calories overshadowed the fear of contamination. Cold nights forced families to choose between risking illness and facing starvation. Most chose the risk. Cooks developed habits that aimed to reduce danger. Though success varied, long boiling helped kill some contaminants, transforming soups into reliable staples. Baking hardened bread enough to discourage mold for a few extra days. Salting, smoking, fermenting, and drying created layers of protection that extended the life of food. Yet none of these methods guaranteed safety. Spoilage began quietly and spread quickly. Even seasoned cooks sometimes misjudge a piece of meat or an aged loaf. Their decisions shaped the well-being of the entire household. Yet they made those decisions with incomplete information. The atmosphere surrounding meals reflected this tension. Before eating, people observed their food closely, looking for signs of color change or odor. Children learned early to identify what seemed trustworthy and what did not. Adults expressed caution without fully articulating their fears. When illness followed a meal, conversation focused on symptoms rather than causes. Families prayed, rested, or sought local healers. Recovery brought relief. Death brought acceptance, shaped by centuries of uncertainty. No conclusion felt definitive because no evidence proved the source. In wealthier households, access to spices, better storage, and more frequent deliveries offered superficial advantages, but not immunity. Spoilage affected all ingredients regardless of status. Nobles and laborers alike faced the same biological realities, even if their meals looked different. Illness spread through castles as easily as through cottages, reminding everyone that food's unpredictability respected no social boundaries. The distinction lay not in safety but in comfort. Wealth could improve presentation, not reliability. What defined medieval eating was not flavor or abundance, but negotiation with risk. Every meal required trust in forces beyond human control: weather, storage, time, and the invisible processes that determined whether food nourished or harmed. People learned to live inside this uncertainty because they saw no way around it. Food offered strength, yet it also threatened it. Survival meant balancing these opposites day after day. These perilous meals reveal how every bite carried a quiet wager between strength and sickness. Another perspective emerges when the focus turns to foods that appeared spoiled yet remained part of daily survival, where tolerance stretched even further. In that perspective lies an unsettling truth about how necessity reshaped the boundary between what was edible and what was merely endured. Mold did not hold the same meaning in medieval life that it does today. In a world where nearly everything carried signs of age, discoloration, or slow decay, mold often appeared not as a warning but as a familiar companion. People lived in homes where damp air clung to walls, where wooden beams darkened over seasons, and where stored food shifted gradually with time. Under these conditions, mold became part of the landscape of survival. Instead of rejecting every speck, households learned to judge it by degree. A little on bread meant inconvenience, a great deal meant loss. Between these extremes lay a spectrum of acceptance shaped by necessity. Cheese provided the clearest example of this acceptance. When milk transformed into curds and hardened over weeks or months, it developed textures and colours that varied widely. Some cheeses carried green, blue, or white veins that modern observers might dismiss as contamination. But medieval families valued these changes. They believed such markings signalled strength or richness, especially in cheeses stored for long periods. The more pronounced the veining, the more prized the wheel became. People consumed these cheeses proudly, associating their sharp flavours with quality, even when the taste bordered on harshness. They welcomed it because it spoke of aging rather than waste. Bread, another staple, followed a different path. Mould crept across its surface with surprising speed, especially in warm or damp seasons. Families watched carefully for early signs of discoloration. When the first patches appeared, they scraped or cut them away, revealing what they believed to be unspoiled bread underneath. They did not see this as negligence, but as practicality. Bread required labour, grain, and heat, resources that households could not afford to waste. Removing the outer mould allowed them to preserve the bulk of the loaf, stretching their supplies through days when food felt scarce. As long as the mould had not penetrated deeply, people considered the remaining portion safe. Fermented foods offered another reason for this tolerance. Medieval households relied on fermentation to extend the life of vegetables, dairy, and even some meats. Through these processes, foods developed strong aromas, sourness, or visible microbial growth. Families treated these qualities as signs of preservation rather than decay. They believed fermented foods strengthened the body, aiding digestion and resilience. This belief grew from observation rather than scientific understanding. People noticed that fermented dishes remained edible longer and often caused fewer stomach troubles than those eaten fresh. As a result, they associated the presence of certain molds or fermenting agents with health rather than harm. The blurred line between beneficial fermentation and dangerous mold created a complicated relationship with food. Households used their senses to distinguish between the two, relying on experience passed down through generations. A grandmother might place her hand on a wheel of cheese, feeling for firmness. A father might smell a loaf of bread, searching for the bitterness that signaled danger. A child might learn to recognize when a jar of fermented vegetables had turned sour in a way that felt wrong. These judgments lacked precision, yet they formed the backbone of daily eating. Storage conditions deepened this complexity. Cellars, pantries, and lofts all offered imperfect protection. Damp air encouraged mold, while dry conditions hardened food beyond usefulness. Households arranged their stores carefully, lifting some foods off the ground and pushing others into corners where the temperature remained cool. Even so, mold found its way into every crevice. People accepted its presence because resistance felt futile. They learned to manage it rather than eliminate it. Social attitudes reinforced this adaptability. Guests rarely commented on the presence of mold, and hosts rarely apologized for it. Everyone understood its inevitability. Instead, conversations centered on flavor, texture, or the labor involved in preparing a meal. Mold became a quiet reminder of the environmental challenges that shaped medieval life. To reject all food touched by it would have meant rejecting survival itself. Yet danger always lurked beneath this tolerance. Some molds produced toxins that caused illness, though people could not identify them reliably. A loaf of bread scraped clean might still carry harmful spores. A cheese valued for its veining might harbour growth that irritated the stomach or caused severe sickness in those with weaker constitutions. When illness followed a meal, people rarely blamed mold directly. They attributed symptoms to imbalance, fatigue, or unfavourable weather. This lack of clarity allowed risky practices to continue. Woven into habits of necessity, despite these risks, households continued to praise foods that embraced controlled forms of decay. Fermented dishes became cherished parts of their diets, providing nutrition long after the harvest had passed. Molded cheeses symbolized endurance, reflecting the skill required to shepherd milk through stages of transformation. Scraped bread represented resourcefulness. These practices reflected resilience in the face of scarcity, proving that families could adapt to the challenges that shaped their environment. Mold, then, functioned as both threat and companion. It signaled the delicate boundary between longevity and loss, forcing families to make choices grounded in their circumstances. They consumed foods marked by age because they understood that freshness was a fleeting luxury. Their relationship with mold reflected a broader truth. Survival depended not on perfection, but on flexibility. These aged foods reveal how medieval households learned to navigate the narrow space between nourishment and hazard. Another layer emerges when attention turns to the smoke-filled rafters, where preservation took shape through fire rather than time, shaping food in ways both protective and unpredictable. That layer reveals how smoke became an unseen guardian of survival. Smoke drifted through medieval kitchens in slow, familiar currents, settling into beams and rafters long before anyone noticed its movement. Fires burned throughout the day, not only for warmth or cooking, but as an unintentional guardian of the household's food. As wood crackled beneath iron pots, smoke filled the air, drying whatever hung above it. Families discovered, almost by accident, that this constant exposure preserved meat, fish, and sausages in ways no other method could match. The process required no careful measurement or specialized knowledge. It relied instead on the simple fact that smoke lingered where people lived, shaping their food as steadily as it stained the walls. Drying formed the first layer of preservation. Meat suspended near the ceiling lost moisture slowly, its surfaces tightening as the weeks passed. Fish hardened into shapes that resisted decay, while sausages transformed into firmer, darker versions of themselves. The warmth rising from the hearth kept the process steady, though the results varied with temperature, humidity, and the type of wood feeding the fire. Families learned to observe these changes, checking the texture of each piece with practiced hands. They accepted the unpredictability because the alternative, food rotting on shelves or in cellars, offered greater risk. Smoke contributed something beyond dryness. Its particles coated the outer surfaces of the food, altering both color and flavor. This coating resisted insects and slowed bacterial growth, creating a barrier that made the preserved items more reliable. Medieval households recognized this effect even without understanding its mechanisms. They saw that smoked meat lasted longer, smelled better, and spoiled less frequently than food stored in other ways. As a result, they hung more items above the hearth, turning the kitchen ceiling into a crowded gallery of supplies that would sustain them through winter. The arrangement of food above the fire reflected each family's needs and resources. In wealthier homes, larger cuts of meat occupied the central beams, soaking in the steady warmth. In humbler cottages, smaller portions hung wherever space permitted. Fish appeared in long rows, their shapes tapering toward the floor. Sausages, bundled with twine, swayed gently in the shifting currents of warm air. These objects greeted anyone who entered the kitchen, forming a constant reminder of the delicate balance between preparation and survival. Flavor became part of this balance. Smoke lent a distinctive aroma that settled into the fibers of the food, shaping tastes that people came to associate with nourishment and security. The scent varied with the type of wood burned. Oak produced deep, heavy tones, while fruitwood created lighter, sweeter notes. These distinctions emerged slowly as families repeated the process season after season. Smoke became not only a preservative, but a subtle storyteller, revealing traces of the environment in which the meal had formed. The unpredictability of the process also shaped people's expectations. Some pieces dried unevenly, leaving softer sections vulnerable to decay. Others absorbed too much smoke, turning bitter or darkened beyond preference. Yet even flawed results held value. A partially dried fish could still be boiled into a stew. A smoky sausage, too intense for direct eating, could be sliced into broth, its harshness diluted by vegetables. Waste remained rare because each preserved item represented a safeguard against future scarcity. Kitchens bore the marks of these practices. Ceilings darkened over time, coated with the residue of countless fires. The smell of smoke clung to clothing, tools, and even skin. Guests noticed the heaviness in the air, yet households regarded it as a necessary companion. Smoke symbolized warmth, continuity, and the steady persistence of daily labor. It connected seasons, bridging the abundance of autumn with the scarcity of winter. Families trusted it because it had preserved the food of their ancestors and would preserve theirs as well. Environmental conditions influenced success, often in ways beyond human control. Damp winters reduced the effectiveness of drying, forcing families to rely more heavily on salting or cooking. Dry seasons produced tougher, longer-lasting goods. People adjusted by shifting the height of the hanging racks or by altering the fuel they used. These adjustments reflected an understanding born not of scientific reasoning, but of deep familiarity with the rhythms of fire and air. Despite its advantages, smoke preservation carried limits. Mold sometimes developed on pieces that hung too long. Rodents, attracted by the scent of drying meat, attempted to reach the beams, prompting families to use traps or rearrange their storage. Insects found openings in sausages or fish, especially during warmer months. Households responded with vigilance rather than certainty. Preservation required constant attention, not a guarantee of success. Yet for all these challenges, smoke remained one of the most dependable tools available. It extended the life of food, made winter more bearable, and created flavors that people learned to crave. Medieval families accepted the imperfections of the method because it aligned with their reality: simple, accessible, and adaptable. Smoke provided protection not through precision but through presence. By weaving itself into textures and scents, smoke shaped medieval diets as profoundly as salt. Fermentation, or drying, it represented the quiet interplay between fire and survival, between environment and daily life. Each piece of smoked food carried the memory of time spent above the hearth, absorbing the warmth that allowed families to endure seasons of scarcity. These smoke-marked foods reveal how fire became a silent partner in extending the life of every household's stores. Another view takes shape when attention shifts to the pots where leftovers simmered back to usefulness. turning scraps into meals that stretched across days. In this view emerges a clearer sense of how persistence transformed waste into sustenance. Leftovers rarely lingered untouched in medieval households. Food held too much value to be wasted, and every scrap represented effort. Planting, harvesting, storing, and cooking. When a meal ended, families gathered what remained, examining bones, crusts, softened vegetables, and fragments of meat. These remnants did not signal the end of usefulness, but the beginning of transformation. They moved into pots waiting beside the hearth, where heat offered the chance to restore them, through slow boiling, steady stirring, and the familiar rhythm of daily labour. Leftovers became soups and stews that nourished families across multiple days. Stews held a central place in this process. A single pot sat over the fire from dawn until night, receiving additions as days passed. A piece of dried meat softened in the broth, releasing flavour that spread through the vegetables. Old bread dissolved into a thickened texture. Bones contributed depth, their marrow blending into the liquid. Households layered ingredients without ceremony, letting the pot absorb whatever the day provided. The stew shifted gradually, taking on new characteristics with each addition. It offered warmth and stability, a meal that evolved rather than disappeared. Soups followed similar patterns. Leftover grains created a base that thickened over time. Vegetables softened into the broth until their shapes blurred, leaving behind flavour and nourishment. Families added small amounts of herbs when available, though even this was considered a luxury. The true value of soup lies in its capacity to stretch resources. A handful of scraps could become a bowl that fed several people, especially children and the elderly. The liquid soothed stomachs, accustomed to harsh or inconsistent meals, offering comfort in a world shaped by uncertainty. Many traditional dishes originated from this practice. Meals that would later be celebrated for their simplicity or rustic charm once began as solutions to scarcity. They emerged from necessity rather than creativity, shaped by the constant desire to avoid waste. People learned to recognize the potential in everything they cooked. A tough crust softened when simmered long enough. A piece of salted meat regained tenderness when boiled. Even fish that had dried unevenly found new purpose when broken into pieces and blended into broth. Nothing stood outside the possibility of reuse. This mindset extended into daily habits. After each meal, households sorted remains into categories: what could be eaten as is, what required transformation, and what belonged to the pot immediately. Bones served more than one purpose. First, they flavoured stew. Later, they might be cracked open for marrow or used to thicken soups further. Even after these uses, they sometimes ended up as tools, mixed into compost, or reserved for future tasks. People believed that waste reflected carelessness, a failure to respect the labour behind each ingredient. The hearth supported these customs, positioned at the centre of the home. It burned nearly constantly, offering the heat needed to maintain simmering pots. Families monitored the flame with quiet attention, ensuring it remained steady. A pot left unattended risked drying out or burning, which could ruin the food and waste precious ingredients. Thus, tending the pot became part of the rhythm of daily life. The gentle bubbling marked time, signalling continuity and the connection between meals past and meals yet to come. Children grew up understanding these practices instinctively. They learned to scrape bowls carefully, to set aside pieces that could be reused, and to respect the pot as a place of quiet transformation. The concept of leftovers carried none of the stigma it holds today. Instead, it symbolized resourcefulness and gratitude. People valued food not only for its immediate taste, but for its capacity to endure, shift, and adapt through thoughtful preparation. Reused meals did not always carry pleasing flavors. Some became overly salty if too much cured meat entered the pot. Others turned sour when vegetables aged beyond their limits. Yet families embraced these imperfections. They knew the alternative: hunger or the need to consume fresh stores too quickly. Flavor mattered, but survival mattered more. They adjusted the taste with onions, NERPs, or additional water when resources allowed, tempering harshness without waste. The unpredictability of these dishes reflected the unpredictability of medieval life. Stews changed according to the season, the harvest, and the household's fortunes. During winter, the pot held dried beans, turnips, and small scraps of meat. In warmer months, it absorbed fresh greens, derps, and more varied ingredients. Through these changes, the pot became a record of the family's circumstances, telling their story with each new layer added to its contents. Even illness influenced how leftovers were used. Households prepared lighter broths for those recovering from fatigue or stomach troubles. These broths grew from the same practice of reuse, stripped of heavy ingredients, but filled with the essence of whatever the pot had held before. Nourishment came not only from quantity, but from continuity. The food sustained families across seasons, bridging times of abundance with times of scarcity. What emerged from these practices was a quiet understanding of resilience. Medieval households did not view leftovers as remnants of past meals, but as resources waiting to be renewed. Each ingredient carried the possibility of becoming something else, shaped by heat, attention, and necessity. Their kitchens became spaces where transformation occurred daily, where nothing ended abruptly, and where survival depended on recognizing value in fragments. These simmered scraps reveal how survival depended on turning every remnant into something usable. Another shift becomes clear when the focus moves from creativity to the stark truth that taste held little meaning in daily life. In that shift waits a harsher understanding of eating, driven by instinct rather than comfort. Meals in medieval life rarely carried aspirations of pleasure. Eating unfolded as a necessary act, shaped by the thin boundary between hunger and survival. Families gathered around simple bowls or shared pots, not to enjoy flavors or celebrate abundance, but to quiet the muscles in their stomachs long enough to continue working. Taste mattered little when the options remained narrow and unreliable. The concept of cuisine did not exist in the way it is understood today. Instead, people measured meals by their ability to sustain labor, endure scarcity, and ease the constant pressure of daily existence. The absence of choice shaped every decision. Households relied on whatever remained in storage, whatever could be gathered, and whatever had not yet spoiled. Vegetables, too, aged for freshness, still entered stews. Meat near the edge of decay was salvaged with boiling or spices, if available. Grain infested with insects was sifted and used anyway. The goal was not to create something enjoyable, but to avoid starvation. When food supply dwindled, families stretched meals with water, stale bread, or dried herbs. Even the most unappealing combination became acceptable if it provided enough energy to face another day. Children learned early that food existed not to please the senses, but to preserve life. They watched adults scrape mold from bread, cut away discolored portions of vegetables, and soak questionable meat in sour liquids to mask its age. These habits passed from one generation to the next, forming a quiet acceptance of discomfort. A bowl of thin porridge served its purpose, even if it tasted bland or bitter. A stew with an uneven texture still brought warmth. People did not refuse what displeased them because refusal carried consequences they could not afford. Hunger shaped the pace of each meal. Workers returned from fields or workshops exhausted, sitting before simple dishes that reflected their limitations. They chewed slowly, sometimes wordlessly, focusing not on savoring, but on restoring strength. Families ate until the ache in their stomach eased, then saved the remainder for later. Leftovers gained importance, not as remnants, but as safeguards. A small piece of dried meat or a handful of grains represented security against an uncertain tomorrow. The environment reinforced this mindset. Winters lasted long. Crops failed. Animals died unexpectedly. And stores of preserved foods shrank more quickly than expected. These fluctuations created periods when households counted every bite. In such times, the idea of refusing food because of taste felt unimaginable. A foul smell suggested caution, but did not guarantee rejection. If boiling, salting, or scraping could reduce the risk. People pressed forward. The balance between desperation and resilience became the foundation of their eating habits. Even in wealthier homes, luxury remained relative. Nobles might enjoy stronger spices, richer meats, or imported grains. But they too lived without the certainty of freshness. Their kitchens struggled with the same environmental conditions, and their cooks employed the same methods of stretching supplies. The difference lay in the resources available, not in the elimination of risk. Wealth could mask problems, soften flavors, and create illusions of abundance. Yet it could not erase the reality of impermanence. The emotional weight of eating reflected the hardships of medieval existence. A meal offered relief from fatigue, but it also reminded families of the fragility of their supplies. People ate with an awareness sharpened by necessity. They recognized how quickly conditions could change. A spoiled batch of stored grain, a failed hunting trip, a sudden illness affecting livestock. Food represented vulnerability as much as nourishment. This understanding formed a quiet undercurrent of tension beneath each meal. Despite these hardships, meals still carried moments of connection. Families shared bowls, passed bread, and tended to one another's needs. These gestures did not create joy in the modern sense, but they created stability. Eating together provided reassurance that survival remained possible. The act of sharing required intention, even when the meal itself lacked variety or comfort. Small routines, stirring the pot, ladling portions, dividing scraps, built cohesion in ways that surpassed flavor. Over time, people adapted their senses to the demands of their environment. Flavors that might seem harsh or unpleasant today have become familiar. The sourness of fermented vegetables, the bitterness of over-dried herbs, and the heaviness of smoked meats. These tastes formed the signature of medieval survival. People found meaning not in culinary enjoyment but in endurance, a meal that filled the stomach, however, imperfectly, fulfilled its purpose. Eating during this era cannot be separated from the broader struggle against scarcity. Food carried no promise of delight. It offered only the possibility of strength. Households understood this instinctively. They approached meals with pragmatism, guided not by desire but by necessity. In this reality, the notion of cuisine dissolved, replaced by a constant negotiation between hunger and survival. These restrained meals reveal how nourishment served primarily as a tool for endurance. Another shift emerges when attention turns to the quiet containers that protected fragile supplies from pests and moisture, allowing families to stretch their resources deeper into each season. Through that shift appears a closer look at the vessels that guarded every stored ingredient. Storage shaped medieval survival as firmly as fields and harvests. Families learned to protect their food from moisture, pests, and the slow decay that crept through every household. They depended on simple containers crafted from clay, wood, cloth, and woven fibers, objects that asked for no refinement but offered steady, dependable service. These vessels stood quietly in corners, hung from beams, or rested half-buried in cool earth, shielding food in ways that felt both ordinary and essential. Each container represented a fragile barrier between a family's labor and the forces that could erase it. Clay jars formed the backbone of this system. Thick and heavy, they held coolness deep within their walls. The earthen material resisted temperature changes, allowing grains, beans, and dried foods to rest in relative stability. Families valued these jars not for appearance but for reliability. Their narrow mouths prevented rodents from entering, while their weight discouraged tipping or gnawing. Some jars bore markings passed down through generations. Simple scratches, faded pigment, or the impression of a maker's hand. Despite their modest construction, they carried the promise of safety. Inside these containers, people arranged their supplies with care. Grains filled the bottom, packed tightly to limit air exposure. Beans rested in layers, checked periodically for moisture or signs of insects. Those with the means added cloth layers between ingredients to reduce friction and slow infiltration. In poorer households, the jar simply held whatever could be spared. Yet the intention remained the same: to preserve as much as possible for as long as possible. Cloth bags offered a different kind of protection, made from coarse fabric woven at home. They held dried fruits, herbs, or nuts, foods too delicate for heavy jars. The cloth allowed air to circulate while keeping pests at bay. Families hung these bags from beams, suspending them above the reach of rodents and rising damp. As seasons changed, the fabric absorbed the scents of the home, smoke from the hearth, dryness from summer air, or faint traces of stored grains. Though the bags wore thin with use, they extended the life of their contents through simple elevation and airflow. Bamboo or wooden baskets added another layer of practicality. Their woven designs allowed families to segment their stores, separating delicate items from those more resistant to decay. People placed eggs, onions, or small bundles of herbs inside baskets, stacking them where sunlight or heat would not intrude. The gaps between the woven strands created ventilation, reducing the risk of molding. These baskets traveled easily, carried to markets or fields when needed, then returned to their place among the household's supplies. Some households practiced a more deliberate form of protection by lining the bottoms of storage jars with quicklime. They believed lime deterred insects and absorbed excess moisture. When properly applied, it formed a thin barrier that kept the lower contents dry. Despite its harshness, people trusted lime because experience taught them its value. They handled it cautiously, aware of its caustic nature. Yet they incorporated it into their storage practices with confidence born of repetition. The organization of storerooms reflected the rhythms of medieval life. Families built shelves along walls, placing heavier containers below and lighter ones above. They grouped foods according to their vulnerability: grains and dried items near the coolest parts of the room, vegetables closer to the entrance, where retrieval came with less disruption. Every season brought adjustments. During wetter months, families lifted containers onto stones to prevent dampness from creeping upward. In hot months, they shifted baskets into shaded corners. These routines filled small pockets of daily labor, reinforcing the understanding that storage required vigilance. Kitchens, too, held their share of vessels. Small clay pots near the hearth stored salt, herbs, or dried scraps used to enrich stews. Wooden boxes held bread, wrapped in cloth to slow staling. Even these containers required protection from insects, prompting families to elevate them or place them near smoke-filled rafters. The effort extended well beyond filling a jar or tying a bag. It required constant attention, a sensitivity to temperature and time that shaped every decision. Children learned the importance of containers early. They helped clean jars, patch fabric bags, or weave small baskets. These tasks introduced them to the responsibilities of managing supplies, responsibilities they would one day inherit. The vessels became symbols of security in a world without guarantees. As long as the containers remained intact, the family held a measure of control over their food. When a jar cracked or a basket broke, the loss felt deeper than the object itself. It signaled vulnerability. Even with careful storage, losses still occurred. Moisture found its way in through unnoticed cracks. Mice gnawed holes in cloth bags. Mold crept across grains when humidity surged. Families responded with resignation rather than surprise, salvaging what they could and discarding the rest. Storage never offered certainty, only improved odds. Yet those odds mattered greatly in a time when every handful of food shaped a family's future. Through these vessels, medieval households extended the life of their resources as far as nature allowed. The containers stood as quiet partners in survival, absorbing heat, resisting pests, and holding fragile supplies in conditions that delayed decay. Their presence reflected the ingenuity of people who possessed little but made much from what they had. Preserving food became an act of patience, discipline, and hope. These guarded stores reveal how survival relied on simple tools shaped by soil, fiber, and careful hands. Another scene opens when attention turns to the cool spaces carved beneath the earth, where families sought refuge from heat to prolong the life of perishables. Through that scene emerges the story of underground chambers used as makeshift cold storage. Families in medieval times relied on the earth itself to slow the decay that shadowed every meal. Beneath their homes, they carved spaces meant to borrow coolness from soil, untouched by sun or wind. These underground rooms formed a quiet refuge for perishables, offering a small extension of time before food surrendered to heat. The air below ground felt still, denser, and reliably cold even during the warmest months, giving households a narrow advantage against the rapid spoilage that shaped their daily lives. Digging a cellar required strength and patience. People chose locations where the soil held firm and moisture remained low. They carved room-like hollows large enough for jars, baskets, and wooden shelves. Stones lined the walls in some homes, though many cellars remained simple earth chambers. What mattered most was temperature. A few degrees cooler could mean an extra day of safety. These spaces transformed the struggle against heat into a manageable routine. By descending into the cellar each morning, a family gained time. Never much, but enough to make a difference. Inside these dugout rooms, families organized their provisions carefully. Vegetables with thicker skins rested close to the floor, where cold settled. Root vegetables lasted longer here than above ground, their firmness preserved by the chill. Containers holding milk or butter were placed near the corners, shielded from warm drafts that slipped through cracks in the floorboards above. Every placement reflected a deep understanding of the cellar's microclimate, learned through years of observation rather than instruction. Because these spaces sat below the home, they required attention to airflow. Ventilation shafts carried moisture outward, preventing mold from spreading too quickly across walls or containers. Households checked these shafts often, clearing debris or nesting animals that blocked the passage of air. Without airflow, the cellar could turn from sanctuary to hazard, encouraging decay rather than slowing it. Maintenance became a constant task, woven into daily routines alongside cooking and cleaning. The coolness of cellars offered only modest protection, yet even modest improvement carried weight. Milk lasted a little longer before souring. Cooked foods could rest overnight without turning dangerous. Herbs dried more evenly when hung from beams in the darkness. These small successes encouraged families to treat their cellars with care, respecting the fragile balance that allowed them to stretch their supplies by precious hours or days. Though the space never achieved the reliability of modern refrigeration, it eased the burden of perishability. Beyond the cellar, wells played an unexpected role in cooling food. Wells dipped deep enough to reach cold groundwater that held a steady temperature year-round. Families lowered jars, buckets, or sealed containers into these depths, allowing the water to wick heat away. Milk, stored this way, thickens more slowly. Butter softened less in the heat. Even cooked dishes, when sealed properly, could rest in the well long enough to remain edible until the next meal. People improvised by tying ropes tightly around jars and weighting them to prevent drifting or tipping. Lowering food into a well-required caution. Containers had to be sealed to prevent contamination. If water seeped inside, the contents spoiled immediately. Some families wrapped jars in cloth before lowering them, hoping to add another layer of protection. Others measured the depth carefully, seeking the level where water felt coldest without submerging the vessel completely. These practices grew from daily necessity, and though imperfect, they allowed perishable foods to last a little longer. The use of wells blended practicality with risk. While the water cooled effectively, it also held the potential for accidents. Ropes snapped, jars broke, or the food picked up unwanted flavors. Even so, households returned to the well again and again, because no other source offered such consistent chill. Many families treated the well as a communal tool. Neighbors shared space for cooling larger containers during the summer or before gatherings. These moments of cooperation revealed how vital cooling had become in a world where heat pressed upon every living thing. The difference between a cellar and a well lies in their limitations. The cellar cooled gently, extending the shelf life of vegetables and grains. The water cooled sharply, benefiting dairy or cooked dishes. Families alternated between the two depending on their needs. Each method carried its own compromise, yet both formed essential parts of medieval survival strategies. The earth and water provided the closest substitutes for modern refrigeration, and people adapted eagerly to their constraints. During warm seasons, the value of cooling methods became more apparent. Problems intensified as the heat thickened the air outside. Fruits softened within hours. Meat spoiled quickly. Even after salting, bread molded faster. Trips to the cellar increased, as did the number of containers lowered into wells. These actions reflected desperation rather than comfort. The quiet urgency of people fighting against nature's pace of decay. Still, each day, a food item lasted meant one less fear to carry. Some families experimented with hybrid methods, using both cellar and well. They cooled a jar in the well first, then stored it in the cellar to maintain the lower temperature. This combination offered limited success, but demonstrated their willingness to innovate with the tools available. Such experimentation highlighted the constant negotiation between scarcity and survival, where every small improvement mattered. Even with dedicated storage spaces, spoilage remained unavoidable. Cold slowed the process, but never stopped it. People learned to anticipate changes in texture, color, or smell, interpreting each as a warning. Cellars and wells softened the blow of decay, but they never erased the relentless countdown attached to every perishable item. That countdown shaped daily cooking, meal planning, and expectations. Yet the importance of these cooling spaces stretched beyond practicality. They provided mental reassurance, knowing that food rested in a cooler place, however imperfect, lessened anxiety. The cellar offered a sense of control. The well offered a brief reprieve. These feelings mattered deeply in a world defined by uncertainty and instability. Survival required not just tools, but confidence in those tools. These underground refuges reveal how families relied on earth and water to slow the steady march of decay. Another truth emerges when attention shifts from storage spaces to the daily act of gathering around a meal shaped by scarcity. In that truth appears a closer view of the table where endurance mattered far more than ritual. The meal they gathered around was never about ceremony. It was a moment carved out of hardship, shaped by whatever food survived the day, and marked by the quiet understanding that eating was nothing more than a temporary defense against hunger. I picture those rooms, dim spaces where smoke hung low, where wooden walls stayed damp even in summer, and where the table, if a household even owned one, served as a shared surface for survival rather than a symbol of etiquette. People did not sit down expecting enjoyment. They sat because the body demanded something. Anything. to keep going. Hands replaced utensils. Bread was not a side dish, but a tool, used as a plate or even as a scoop. Once soaked through with broth or oil, that bread would be eaten as well, leaving no trace that it had ever held the meal together. There was no thought of waste, no concept of presentation, no distinction between courses. Everything went into one pot, boiled until soft, then divided among those who waited. The idea of personal forks or knives belonged to nobles and distant courts. Ordinary people shared whatever utensils existed, passing them hand to hand without hesitation. Germs were not part of their vocabulary. Survival was. Meals were often silent, not out of formality but exhaustion. A day's labour left little strength for conversation. People bent over bowls of thin porridge or watery soup, their breaths rising in faint clouds when winter crept indoors. Hunger softened every rule. Children dipped fingers into the pot before it reached the table, and adults barely scolded them. Food was not something to be protected with manners. It was something to protect with vigilance, always thinking of how long it had to last. Most kitchens did not contain the ingredients needed to build a dish in any modern sense. Flour stretched into coarse bread, oats boiled until they thickened into something spoonable, and vegetables softened into shreds after hours of simmering. Meat was rare enough that it felt closer to a memory than a component of daily meals. When a joint of salted pork or smoked fish appeared, it flavoured the pot rather than filling it. The meat might be pulled out afterward and saved to flavour something else later. The broth mattered more than the bone. And despite all of this, mealtime had a strange intimacy to it. People leaned close because there was only one light, usually a sputtering tallow candle, and only one pot. They shared the same food, the same heat, the same struggle to make each bite stretch further. Poverty erased the distance between them. There was no higher place at the table, no elaborate seating order, no pretense. Hunger leveled everything. Eating from a communal pot also meant accepting that every flaw, every hint of spoilage, every gritty mouthful belonged to all of them. If the grain had mold scraped from its surface, everyone tasted the faint sourness lingering underneath. If the water was murky or the pot carried yesterday's grit, nobody complained. Complaints did not create food. Complaints did not make winter shorter or the harvest larger. People swallowed what they were given, knowing their turn to provide scraps or broth for others would come soon enough. Sometimes, bread from several days earlier became so hard it could only be softened by soaking it in soup until it sagged and crumbled. But even then, it was valuable. A crust that still had weight was better than none at all. Families learned how to divide food by instinct, by a shared awareness of each other's limits. The youngest received the softest pieces. The elderly were given portions that required the least chewing. Acts of care happened quietly, disguised as routine gestures. On rare days when meals felt slightly fuller, perhaps an extra handful of grains, or a piece of vegetable unexpectedly found at the bottom of a storage jar. People noticed, though they did not celebrate. Celebration risked hope. Hope risked disappointment. Stability meant eating steadily, without expectation, without imagining that tomorrow might bring something better. Tables, when they existed, were crude boards placed on barrels or uneven legs. They creaked under the smallest weight. Spills were absorbed instantly by the wood, leaving permanent stains that marked seasons of hardship. The surface never looked clean, only less dirty than the ground. But it was enough. A flat place to set a pot was a luxury. What stands out most is how eating was understood not as a social ritual but as a shared endurance. People gathered because being together made the hardship feel slightly less sharp. Food was consumed because they needed strength to continue the next task. The next day, the next season, there was no concept of flavour, no illusion of variety, just sustenance, passed from hand to hand. Meals were repetitions of the same truth, that life in a medieval household balanced on thin supplies and shared endurance, and that every mouthful was a reminder of how fragile a day's survival could be. This table of survival shows how hunger shaped every gesture, from bread used as a plate to hands reaching into a shared pot. Another view emerges when attention shifts toward the community rules that governed what could be eaten and when. Beneath those rules waits a quiet tension that shaped daily choices in ways few would expect. Food poisoning was not a rare disaster, but a steady presence in medieval life. Something people recognized without fully understanding. They lived with the quiet knowledge that anything placed in the mouth could betray them. A piece of meat might look acceptable in the dim light of a single candle. A crust of bread might feel firm enough to eat. A pot of stew might smell only faintly sour after reheating. None of these signs gave real assurance. People simply learned to continue eating despite uncertainty, because hunger allowed no hesitation. Meat was the most dangerous. Without cold storage, it began to change within hours. The outer layer darkened. The fat softened into a greasy film, and insects found their way into cracks nobody noticed. But meat was precious. Throwing it away was unthinkable. So families trimmed off the worst parts, disguised the smell with onions or vinegar, and boiled the rest until the pot filled with steam that masked the truth. They hoped that fire would make the food trustworthy again, even though they knew, somewhere beneath the hope, that boiling could not reverse rot. Bread carried risks of its own, stored in humid rooms or in baskets near damp walls. It grew mold quickly. People cut away the green or white patches and ate what remained. Mold did not frighten them. They had grown used to it, turning necessity into familiarity. Some even believed a faintly fermented taste meant the bread was stronger or more nourishing. The illness that followed days later was rarely connected in their minds to the food. Life was full of sicknesses already, and the causes blended until none stood out clearly. Most poisonings began quietly, a twisting in the stomach, a sudden heat rising to the face, a dizziness that felt like exhaustion at first. People continued working, believing the feeling would pass. When the pain sharpened into stabbing cramps, when sweat gathered on the forehead, when the body shook and weakened, the truth appeared too late. There were no doctors for ordinary people, no remedies to counteract toxins, no safe rest. The sick lay on hard beds or on the floor, breathing in shallow gasps while their families watched. Helpless, some improved for a while, then worsened suddenly, collapsing into fever or vomiting until their strength disappeared. Others slipped into silence, unable to speak, unable to drink. Death in these conditions was not dramatic. It came quietly, as if the body simply surrendered. Families grieved, but the grief was muted by exhaustion and by the understanding that survival was always fragile. Food poisoning did not create fear the way plague or war did. Instead, it blended into the background of daily life. People accepted it the same way they accepted cold winters, failed harvests, and long days of labor. The danger did not stop them from eating. It only reminded them that every meal carried risk. That risk made eating feel less like nourishment and more like a negotiation with the body, an attempt to give it strength while hoping it did not reject the offering. Shared meals made the threat more visible. When several members of a household grew ill at once, the cause became obvious. Yet nothing could be done. The pot that fed them also harmed them. The bread that filled their hands also weakened them. But food could not be undone, and hunger would return the next day. People learned not to blame the cook or the ingredients. Blame had no meaning without the possibility of change. Communities spoke quietly about families who lost children after a spoiled meal. But the stories faded quickly. People could not afford to dwell on tragedy. They had crops to tend, water to haul, animals to feed, and fires to keep alive. Survival demanded movement, not reflection. Even when death came repeatedly to the same village, the cause remained a whisper rather than a warning. Poverty allowed no alternatives, and alternatives were what safety required. Some households tried to prevent these dangers by storing food in deeper cellars, salting more heavily, or cooking in smaller portions. But these attempts offered only thin protection. In warm seasons, spoilage outpaced caution. In cold seasons, scarcity pushed people to eat food long past its ideal state. Hunger did not wait for certainty, and certainty did not exist. Looking back, what stands out is not the presence of poison, but the absence of choice. People did not gamble because they enjoyed risk. They gambled because there was no other way to exist. Food poisoning became a companion to hunger, unwelcome, unpredictable, and unavoidable. The line between nourishment and harm remained thin, shifting with weather, storage, and luck. Every bite was an acceptance of that fragile line. Every meal was a quiet acknowledgement that living required trusting food that might not deserve trust. In that tension, medieval life unfolded, day after day, season after season, marked by endurance rather than security. This fragile balance between hunger and harm shows how survival erased the boundary between necessity and danger. Another truth emerges when we turn toward the rules that governed eating. Rules shaped less by faith than by scarcity. In those rules lies a quiet struggle between belief and the demands of an empty stomach. Religious rules shaped daily eating as firmly as hunger did, creating a rhythm that people followed even when their stomachs argued against it. Days of strict fasting arrived throughout the year, and on those days the expectation was clear: no meat, no rich dishes, nothing that suggested indulgence. People obeyed because obedience was woven into life, and breaking the rule carried social and spiritual weight. Still, hunger rarely cared for rules, and the poor felt that conflict more sharply than anyone. Salted fish became a familiar part of fasting days, stored in barrels or hung in smoke-darkened kitchens. It waited until the calendar dictated its use. Prepared without luxury, the fish offered sustenance but little comfort. Its texture was often tough from preservation, and the salt stung the tongue long after the last bite. Boiled vegetables accompanied it, usually whatever grew easily or survived storage, such as turnips, onions, or cabbage. These meals were plain, predictable, and a reminder that fasting was as much about endurance as devotion. For many households, especially those living on the edge of scarcity, religious fasting blended into everyday necessity. The meat was already rare. Fresh produce was seasonal. The difference between a fast day and an ordinary day sometimes felt small, but expectations remained, and people believed that following the rule maintained order in their communities. Shared restraint created a sense of unity, even if that unity was built on hunger. Despite this, people found ways to soften the difficulty. Some dishes pretended to be what they were not. Cooks mashed vegetables into shapes that resembled meat or seasoned grains to mimic the richness of a broth forbidden during fasting. These false fasting foods helped people feel compliant while easing the discomfort of strict rules. No one spoke openly about the pretense, but many understood that survival required small acts of bending without breaking. In wealthier households, fasting did not feel as severe. Better storage, access to imports, and more varied ingredients allowed them to create meals that appeared austere while tasting far more satisfying than those of the poor. Almond milk, for example, replaced dairy on forbidden days. Fish pies, though technically allowed, could be elaborate. Spices disguised the simplicity of the ingredients. The rules applied to everyone, but comfort did not. For the poor, fasting magnified vulnerability. On days without meat, the lack of calories weakened bodies, already strained by labor and limited diets. People continued working in fields, workshops, and kitchens without additional nourishment. Hunger became a quiet companion, yet they rarely complained. Complaints changed nothing, and the idea of discipline, spiritual, communal, or imposed, kept them silent. Eating together on fasting days created a different kind of atmosphere at the table. The conversations, already sparse in many homes, grew even quieter. People focused on finishing what they had, aware that the next meal would resemble this one. Children felt the strain most strongly, their bodies quick to show discomfort. Parents tried to reassure them, offering small pieces of bread dipped in thin broth or promising a fuller meal when the fasting period ended. But promises meant little when supplies ran low. Still, fasting reinforced social expectations. Those who followed the rules were seen as respectable, obedient, and trustworthy. Those who broke them risked judgment. Even though enforcement was inconsistent, the pressure of community opinion was enough to maintain compliance. People watched one another closely, quick to notice who ate what on which day. Privacy was rare, and food was a visible indicator of character. Over time, these rules shaped identity. People knew themselves as part of a system that dictated not just how to pray, but how to eat. The repetition of fasting days created a cycle that marked each season, each celebration, and each hardship. It gave structure to lives that had little structure elsewhere. Even when the rules caused strain, they also provided meaning. However fragile, some found comfort in the predictability. Others endured it as one more constraint they could not escape. The difference mattered little. The rules remained. And people adapted. They learned to stretch ingredients, to hide their compromises, and to maintain appearances. What they ate, or pretended not to eat, became part of the unspoken understanding of survival. Looking back, what stands out is not strict adherence or rebellion, but the quiet negotiations between belief and need. People balanced faith with the physical demands of their bodies, neither fully surrendering nor fully resisting. That balance shaped every meal, every choice, and every day marked by hunger. This steady discipline shows how eating was shaped by obligation as much as appetite. Another direction appears when attention shifts toward the idea of food as property, guarded as tightly as coin or cloth. Toward that notion waits a glimpse of households where every grain and scrap carried the weight of survival. Food functioned as a form of wealth in medieval communities, measured not by flavor or variety, but by the simple fact that it could keep a family alive. Every household understood that their stores determined how well they could endure the shifting hardships of the year. Grain, dried vegetables, salted meat, and any other preserved food held a value that went beyond price. They were not only provisions for the present, but also security for the weeks and months to come. People guarded these supplies carefully, often more carefully than coins, because coins could not be eaten. Shared storage existed in many villages. Communal granaries or shared barns were built from necessity rather than generosity. When harvests were good, each family contributed a portion to the common store. This practice protected the community from sudden shortages, crop failures, or a winter harsher than expected. Families did not access these stores freely. Distribution followed strict rules, decided by elders or by long tradition. Every handful taken was recorded in memory or in writing when literacy allowed. The system was imperfect, yet it prevented starvation when individual stores ran dangerously low. Inside private homes, food was managed with an equal sense of seriousness. Many households created what they called their winter reserve. These supplies were kept separate from daily use, stored high in rafters, sealed in clay containers, or hidden behind wooden panels. Only the person responsible for managing the household, often the wife or eldest daughter, knew exactly how much remained. Opening these reserves before the appointed season was considered a sign of poor judgment. Using them too quickly brought silent worry, while stretching them successfully brought quiet pride. Some communities developed detailed methods for tracking their food. Simple wooden tablets, pieces of chalked slate, or small parchment sheets were used to record the weekly amounts of grain, dried legumes, or preserved meat still left. These records did not exist for orderliness alone. They guided decisions about planting, gathering, and rationing. They also shaped expectations about what the family could afford to eat tomorrow, next week, or in the final stretch of winter. A small error or a forgotten note could mean real danger. Scarcity shaped behavior as much as any rule. People learned to see every piece of food as part of a larger calculation. A small bag of oats represented breakfast for several days. A wedge of dried cheese could last weeks if used sparingly. A pot of barley stored in a cool corner meant a cushion against sudden illness or an unexpected guest. Nothing was viewed as trivial. Even crumbs collected from the table were added to soups or fed to animals that later returned value to the family. This view of food also created boundaries between generosity and necessity. Sharing existed, but it was measured. A neighbor could be offered a portion of grain if their situation became desperate. Yet the decision was always weighed carefully. Helping too freely risked one's own survival. Refusing to help risked social tension. People navigated this balance quietly, aware that a misjudgment could alter relationships for years. Children grew up learning these expectations. They were taught not to waste, not to take without asking, and not to eat more than what was given. What appeared harsh from a modern perspective was simply preparation for a life where misusing food had real consequences. They watched adults scrape pots clean, save stale bread for thickening future meals, and measure grain with steady, practiced movements. These routines taught them that food was not guaranteed. It was earned, guarded, and respected. The presence of rodents, insects, or dampness added another layer of pressure. Families used traps, smoke, or raised storage platforms to protect their reserves. They inspected containers regularly for signs of mold or intrusion. Losing even a small portion to pests meant losing labor, time, and security. Some households sprinkled a thin layer of ash or lime around storage areas to deter animals. Others kept cats, specifically for guarding grain. Every strategy reflected the same reality. Food was too precious to surrender without a fight. As the year progressed, these stored supplies shaped the village's mood. In late autumn, people felt confident, knowing their barns were full. By midwinter, that confidence faded into caution. Late winter brought a mix of anxiety and calculation, as families measured their remaining supplies more closely than ever. Spring brought relief, but only after months of tension. This cycle repeats each year, teetering between abundance and uncertainty. Looking at this system, it becomes clear that food storage was not just about preservation. It was about discipline, foresight, and collective understanding. The community depended on these habits as much as individuals did. Even when meals were small, even when hunger pressed hard, people found ways to stretch what they had, because the alternative was unthinkable. This careful guarding of every grain and scrap shows how survival shaped the meaning of food far more than appetite. Another step emerges when attention turns to the earth itself as the final refuge for storage during the harshest months. From that shift comes a glimpse of hidden cellars and cold wells used as improvised lifelines. Hunger shaped medieval life more sharply than any ruler, any law, or any belief. When fields failed, when storms ruined crops, or when war trampled farmland, food stopped being a daily routine and became a desperate search. People ate what they could swallow, not what they preferred. Bark peeled from trees, softened by boiling, became a bitter paste. Roots normally fed to animals were dug from frozen earth and cooked into a thin porridge. Insects were gathered in baskets and eaten quickly before they escaped. These choices did not reflect custom or courage. They reflected survival. Scarcity tightened its grip the strongest during long winters. Families who had planned carefully still watched their reserves shrink faster than they had hoped. Every sack of grain grew lighter. Every rack of dried fish grew barer. When the final weeks of the season arrived, the difference between endurance and collapse could depend on a single pot of barley or a single wheel of dried cheese. People rationed with precision, not hope. Each meal was measured. Each mouthful was counted. The fear of running out settled into the corners of their homes. During the hardest years, entire villages confronted hunger together. Some households pooled what remained, knowing that none of them could survive alone. Others guarded their stores closely, worried that generosity would become impossible to sustain. Hunger pressed on the mind as much as the body. People grew quieter, slower, and more watchful. Work continued, but with diminished strength. The cold seemed sharper. The nights felt longer. Leather became food when nothing else remained. Shoes were boiled until softened. Belts were stripped into thin strands and simmered to release whatever nourishment they still contained. The taste offered little comfort. The texture provided little strength. But the act of eating something, anything, kept people alive for another day. In those moments, food lost all connection to pleasure or culture. It became a calculation of survival. Stories passed down through generations recorded these periods of hardship with a tone of acceptance rather than shock. They described years when men searched forests for edible moss, and women gathered wild plants known for their bitterness. Children learned early that hunger was not unusual. Instead, it was a cycle that returned often enough to be expected. These memories shaped how communities prepared for the future. They stored more when they could. They dried more fish, salted more meat, and planted crops with longer storage life. But preparation could never fully erase the threat. A single failed harvest could undo years of effort. Communities endured these trials without dramatic declarations. There was no sense of heroism, only necessity. People ate less, worked carefully, and conserved energy. Meals grew smaller and less frequent. Conversations faded. The rhythm of daily life narrowed to a single focus. Hold on long enough for the next season to arrive. In that waiting, people experienced the full weight of uncertainty. What stands out is how hunger blurred the lines between rich and poor, even though the wealthy suffered less. Those with resources stretched their supplies with substitutes. Those without resources scraped the last crumbs from storage jars and lifted lids, hoping to find a forgotten scrap. Yet both groups understood that food defined the boundaries of life. Wealth offered more protection, but not absolute protection. History recorded noble families who starved during sieges, and wealthy merchants who lost everything in harsh winters. Hunger was impartial in its reach. The emotional landscape of these times was marked by caution. Parents taught children not to complain and not to ask for more than what was given. They explained that food could not be wasted. Not even a small drop of broth or a crust of bread. These lessons, learned early, stayed with them throughout adulthood. Wastefulness was not simply frowned upon, it was viewed as dangerous. Waste meant carelessness. Carelessness meant risk. Risk meant hunger. During spring thaws, when the first green shoots appeared, the sense of relief was deep but restrained. People knew that the new growth would not feed them immediately. Their bodies were weakened. Their supplies were nearly gone. They waited for the right moment to begin gathering new food, careful not to damage early crops or exhaust fragile resources. Survival demanded patience, even in the face of renewed hope. Looking back, what becomes clear is how medieval people faced these conditions with a calm born from long experience. They did not expect abundance. They did not imagine safety. They lived with the understanding that every year could bring loss. Their relationship with food was grounded in awareness, Food was never guaranteed, never permanent, and never separate from the threat of hunger. This awareness shaped their traditions, their meals, and their quiet acceptance of hardship. The phrase food, in this context, becomes almost misleading. It did not represent enjoyment or creativity. It represented endurance. Meals were markers of continued survival. Each bowl of thin porridge, each crust of stale bread, and each scrap of dried vegetables carried the same message. Hold on. In this sense, food was simply the name they gave to whatever kept them alive. Across centuries, these realities remained largely unchanged. Even as tools improved and techniques evolved, the structure of medieval life continued to revolve around scarcity. People respected their stores because they knew how easily they could vanish. They respected the land because they knew how dependent they were upon it. They respected the seasons because they had no power to change them. This understanding guided every decision, from planting to harvesting to rationing. It shaped the identity of their communities. To call medieval food a symbol of desperation is not an exaggeration. It is an acknowledgement of the conditions that shaped their world. Hunger sat at the edge of every season, waiting for misfortune to open a door. And when it did, people responded with the only tools they had: caution, endurance, and acceptance. These responses did not eliminate suffering, but they allowed life to continue. As the final part of this journey closes, the images that remain are quiet ones. A family scraping the last porridge from a pot, a mother dividing a stale loaf with steady, measured hands, a village counting its grain and hoping it will be enough, a child chewing on a strip of softened leather because nothing else remains. These scenes are not dramatic, yet they reveal the deepest truth of medieval eating. Survival was the only ingredient that mattered. Thank you for staying with this long journey through a world shaped by hunger, caution, and quiet endurance. I wish you rest, peace, and a gentle night. Good night.